Hey guys, welcome to part 1 of What If Naruto was in Star Wars. If you enjoy the video, then like, share and subscribe, and also comment your thoughts as it inspires me to make more such videos, and remember to check out my playlist section for other interesting stories. So let's get started. Chapter 1. To ask why we fight is to why leaves fall. It is in their nature. Darth Carr. Lord. Death hung over him like a vulture, stripping his carcass bare. He had been bested by his enemy. Beaten. Broken. The storm roared over their heads, a world of storms that would never cease its torrential rain. Not a once would the sun shine on these lands. A single scarlet saber hung over his head, its heat searing into his neck, its hook handle engraved into his mind forevermore. He struggled to push it away, but his hands would not respond, his legs would no comply with the demand to rise and continue the fight. His opponent removed the blade from his neck, and held it high, a single crimson lance piercing the stormy heavens. He uttered but a single sentence, a phrase that pierced the gloom between them. There can be only one. The blade came crashing down, and then there was only blackness. Time to wake up, master. Golden eyes the color of evening skies snapped open to the sound of a woman's voice. A dream. Ah yes. He remembered now. It was just a dream. Nothing more. The knowledge came back to him as soon as he sought it, and he pounced upon it, fingers closing around the memory like an iron fist. He'd finally fallen asleep, and the dawn had finally come. Now, the man known merely as Master blinked the sleep from his eyes, his stern features pinched in a frown as the world reluctantly came back to him. The last vestiges of his nightmare clung to him, insidious whispers of pain and despair promising him oblivion if he did not soon act to eliminate his enemy. He carefully ignored them. He'd learnt long ago that to rebel against Stone's future guaranteed catastrophe. He would remain on guard, as he always had, would remain ever vigilant against any and all threats to the small empire he'd erected, and that would be the end of that. A low growl fled from his lips, a predator skulking in its den. Servant, he croaked. What time is it? 12:30, my master. Came the reply. He ruthlessly bit back a groan. Already? Yes, my lord. Once more the voice rang within the confines of his mind, ushering his body forth from the murky haze of sleep. Brushing the bedraggled blonde bangs from his face, he raised a scarred palm, reflecting upon his fingers in a feeble attempt to ward off the early morning light while his eyes adjusted. But there was nothing feeble about this man. He radiated power, every inch of him, the most subtle air of arrogance and malice offset by a touch of passion lurking in those sinister saffron slits. He turned his head from where he lay, and abruptly he was wide awake, his mind alerted by the sudden and unwelcome presence of another in his inner sanctum. Sakura. He all but spat the name. You were to wake me at dawn. My sincerest apologies, my lord. He briefly entertained the thought of destroying her in recompense for her constant temerity, only to discard it. With the Godame dead, she was the foremost healer in the land. Perhaps even the entire galaxy. No, he told himself, her use as a healer still outweighed any lingering irritation he might still feel at her presence. For now. But when the day came that another surpassed her, well, he wouldn't have any more use for her now, would he? I trust you slept well, your lordship. The voice asked of him once more. Its owner stood just beyond the field of his peripheral vision, green eyes averted, head downcast, face hidden by short pink tresses framing her heart-shaped face. He glowered at her for the span of a single beat, his anger simmering at the corners of his consciousness. Her presence angered him, but he refused to let his emotions master him. The fury was his to control, his to use as he saw fit. Schedule. He barked at the woman, refusing to so much as look her in the eye as he rose. If the woman was at all aware of this blatant disrespect, she did little to show it. You have a 2:00 meeting with the village council, she began, reciting what would soon prove to be a lengthy list of his day-to-day activities. Followed by a meeting with the Jedi ambassador from Coruscant at 3, followed by lunch. Then your presence is humbly requested by Lords Rakage and Sakikage to discuss the matters of your newest apprentices minus. Tell the old fools to come here. He growled out, interrupting her. They know, I cannot leave the planet. The pink cat bowed. It shall be done, milord. She risked a glance at him as he rose, propping himself up on his elbows, revealing his naked torso to the world. His body was chiseled yet lean in the early morning light. Mark for mark that of a warrior. A blacksman and a shinobi in every way. Yet even he was not without his own set of scars. They crisscrossed his back and shoulders, lined the length of his arms and even his neck. Each countless times where he'd passed within a hairsbreadth of his final death. Sometimes she wondered why she still stayed with him. Why she still served the man who'd killed her first love and now held her second hostage. He clearly loathed the very sight of her after what she'd done to him, but her ability to heal outstripped all others. Not all could mend their own wounds as he could, and thus her services were still needed. For now. In the old days, she could have easily plied her charms to get whatever she wanted from him. Back then she had only to bat her eyelashes, and he became putty in her hands, willing to do whatever she wished, so long as she wished it. Those days were long since gone. Her one-time love had outgrown her long ago, moved on to bigger and better things. And, when he finally found a healer that surpassed her in skill, well, she'd just have to ensure that never happened now, wouldn't she? Why are you still staring? Sakura Haruo flinched as the master's gaze pinioned hers, skewering her to the wall with the force of his stare. Before she could open her mouth to protest, before she could think to deny whether she'd been staring at his body, he reacted. Violently. Even as the words formed on her lips, he pinched two fingers together and an invisible hand closed around her throat. She gasped, the air dying in her lungs, her careful machinations falling away, her feet scrabbling against empty air as he lifted her from the floor. My deepest apologies, Naruto. She gasped out, regretting her words as the hold upon her windpipe intensified as he crushed it still tighter. Please. Forgive me, Darth Carr. The choke lessened marginally, her eyes all but bulging as he gestured with his hand. Her back greeted the wall with enough force to break bone, the hardened walls biting into her spine a moment longer before he released her. Carr. Darth Carr. An amalgamation of his own name, and that of the creature sealed inside him. Fitting. The title was by no means unintentional, he was Sith. He'd studied the holocron he'd found, learned of the dark powers within him, a power he and others could command at will. It wasn't at all long before he discarded his old name, taking on the mantle of Darth. How long had it been since he'd taken to calling himself thus? Carr. Nearly a decade now, surely. Funny, how time slipped in and out of one's hands when blessed by longevity. Do not let me catch you staring at me like that again, he warned, allowing her to stand woodenly without care. Do not call me that again, he continued, lest I will find another use for you and your talents. And I promise you, Sakura, you won't enjoy it. Sakura shivered. She knew his words were real. She'd seen him rip a man in half just for insulting one of his apprentices. He was quite capable of cruelty when it suited him, and it suited him now. She managed a soft nod as her liege and lord lowered his hand, the last remnants of the invisible hand finally fleeing from her throat. He began to pull himself from his bed, a feat easier said than done when one considered the number of young women nestled against his lower body. Women. Plural. As in more than one. Much more. Many more. Their number leapt from 1 to 5, then 10 as his golden gaze raked across the spacious bed, some his apprentices, others his wives, and still others mere servants he'd bedded on a whim. Nor were they of the same race and species altogether, amongst them a cerulean-skinned Twi'lek nestled most prominently against his lower leg, her twin Leku twitching now as she stirred against him. Master. Go back to sleep, Layla. He soothed, touching a hand to the former Jedi's face, cupping her cheek in his fingers. The Twi'lek sighed at his touch, chocolate brown eyes not yet golden drifting shut as she returned unto slumber. Carr felt a spike of anger trail across the room at him. It came from Sakura. He favored her with a smirk, his fingers trailing across the Twi'lek's bare back, savoring her smooth skin. Sith though he might be, that did not make him an uncaring by nature. He'd found that a fatal flaw in his predecessors, the ones who trained him, had been cold and ruthless and implacable, refusing to care for anyone other than their own ambitions. It was not a mistake their former apprentice would be making anytime soon. Though he did find it tedious to negotiate with these hated Jedi rather than wipe them out altogether. Their tolerance lay not in the fact that he'd slain dozens of their order, but rather in his own reluctance to leave his homeworld and seek out others of his own kind. Order or not, their numbers were few, and those he did not kill often fell prey to the power he commanded. Vela was merely one of them. Did that make him a bad influence? He didn't think so. It was not as if he made them follow him, he simply showed those of the light that they were helpless before the true power of the dark side. And if they were wise enough to cast off the shackles of the light and study under him, then who was he to refuse them their wisdom? Still, the sheer number of women in his bed boggled the mind. How could one man possibly find comfort, let alone sleep, in such a coffin of flesh and sex? Quite easily, once you became accustomed to it. It had taken him some time to accept that his power would call others to him both in his own village and across the known galaxy, but never in his wildest dreams had he dreamed that so many would ally to his cause. Some had taken convincing, others bowed before his power, forsaking all they knew in service to him. And more. The memory of last night's passionate orgy stole a sinister smile from his features. His gaze glazed across the Sith holocron at his bedside, safeguarded by countless contact poisons. Anyone fool enough to touch that most prized possession of his would die within minutes without the antidote. Were it not for this sacred artifact on his nightstand, he'd never have known of the power he possessed. The power of his mother and that of Clan Uzumaki. They'd been all but wiped from the face of the earth, save for himself and his cousin Karin. Now he knew why. The fools had feared their power. Not just that of the seals, but the powerful and inherent talents of the Force itself. This innocent-looking little cube had been his first step, all those years ago. During a routine mission to the ruinated land of Uzagakure to investigate the ruins of the Uzumaki clan had led to the discovery of the holocron in a secret room beneath the rubble. Uncaring for his nakedness, he pulled himself from the tangle of women and padded across the floor. "Sakura," he growled, pushing past her. "Why are you still standing there?" Fear radiated outward from the pinkette in waves, palpable to him even from across the room. A prickle of irritation pricked him at her cowardice, but he carefully chose to ignore it. Rather, he reached past her, plucking a robe from the dresser, a thick hand shading his face from the encroaching rays of sunlight. An errant thought sent the shutters slamming shut, startling Sakura. "Leave us," he barked, beckoning with a heavy hand. For a moment, it looked as though she might refuse. He saw the anger behind those eyes of jade. And desire. Jealousy that she was not one of the females to join him in his bed. She would never be one of them. Once she might have been, but not after her betrayal. Now, she would never be. She would know what it was like to have the one she loved tormented day in and day out, with only her loyal service ensuring his survival. A small part of him, a very, very small part, said that this was wrong. The rest of it roared at it, until it retreated, cowering into a corner. He took no small amount of joy and pleasure as she flung her from the room fuming. He felt a subtle tug against his wrist, an unfocused force pull that did little more than draw him a step backwards and towards the bed. He arched a bright brow as he saw that some of his apprentices had begun to stir. A host of golden eyes greeted his own. Now he could understand her anger. She'd sensed that his apprentice had begun to stir. He dropped the robe, allowing the black garment to pool at the floor. "Naruto-sama," one of them whispered, favoring him with a coy smile, an expression that made his knees buckle with yearning and desire. He only ever allowed them, his students, to call him by his true name. Anyone else who dared invoke the ghost of Uzumaki Naruto was punishable by death. "You weren't going to leave us, were you?" purred another. "Of course not." Carr smiled. "I could never leave you unattended." He could have easily created shadow clones to satisfy them, But there was just something so satisfying when it came to indulging in the pleasures of one's flesh that he could not bear to refuse them any longer. Neglecting the possibility of using clones, he strode back to the bed, eating up the distance between them in swift, thick strides. Their hands reached out for him, a chorus of giggles greeting him as he slid back into bed. Now, ladies, where were we? Layla was the one to answer him. You were allowing us to please you, master. Naruto grinned a ferocious grin as the blue-skinned Twi'lek crawled into his lap, beating her fellow apprentices to the punch. A chorus of frustrated groans greeted their sudden coupling when she melded her mouth with his, tongue dancing over him with a fervorous desire. He felt the other's hands against him, seeking to pry his newest apprentice away, yet not daring to cause her harm. The occasional squabble was held at bay only by his power. They knew better than to try and kill one another. The last time two of his former apprentices decided to duke it out, they'd nearly gotten themselves killed, and Lord Carr was furious for months on end. For a being to anger him meant certain death. When they finally broke apart, he wanted nothing more than to take the former knight right then and there. Was I? You've had your fun, Mela. One of them growled. Now it's my turn. Carr cackled, feeding off their anger and frustration, and of course, their lust. It was like a drug, he couldn't get enough of it. Ladies, one at a time, there's plenty for everyone. Their response was to drag him forward, hauling him into the sea of bodies. He was only slightly disappointed that their lightsabers hadn't come out this time, but he soon found himself contented in other matters all the same. His gaze slipped to the holocron once more as their hands and mouths roamed over every inch of him, reflecting back on what it was that had led him to become the supreme ruler of this planet. This innocent-looking little cube had been his first step toward greatness all those years ago. A routine mission to the ruinated land of Uzumaki to investigate disappearances surrounding the ruins of the Uzumaki clan had led to more than just the discovery of the perpetrator, but a holocron secreted away in an ancient chamber room beneath the rubble. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Chapter 2, Where It All Began. Killing someone in cold blood. That's just wrong. Uzumaki Naruto, soon to be Dark Lord of the Sith. Where it all began. It began long ago in the ruins of the land of whirlpools. Assigned to instigate a strange series of disappearances, a squad had been sent out, and to Naruto's delight, he would be joining them. It hadn't been easy. He'd all but begged to be sent on this mission, even going so far as to prostrate himself before Tsunade Bakken. He was an Uzumaki, he'd argued. This might be his only chance to see the ruins of his land, to learn about a heritage he'd never known. Hell, he might even learn who his parents were. He may have forgotten to mention the last part to Tsunade though. Back then, he hadn't been entirely focused on the mission, nor had he expected to find much, maybe a few scrolls or something. Never in his wildest dreams had he hoped to find anything of special significance, but he had to see the ruins of his clan's land for himself. It was a whimsy of his younger days, one he spat upon now. He'd been naive, foolish, stupid. That same stupidity had nearly cost him the lives of his friends. He risked a glance at other members of his squad. He was the only member of Team 7 present. The rest of them were not on the assignment today. Rather, he found himself surrounded by familiar faces here in this joint operation. Among them Yamanaka Ino Temurai, and to his disbelief, led by Mitarashi Anko. Looking back, what the hell had Tsunade been thinking? In her haste to assemble a squad, she'd gone and thrown together three of the most unpredictable females he'd ever met. And that was only the first group. Their second squad was composed of Inuzuka Kibo, a lifelong friend of his with whom he had no problem working with, as well as Shinoabarama, Hinata Hyuga, and the like. That was where it ended. Because they were being led by Kurena Yu. There was a certain coldness to be said about the Jounin sensei. Her body could drive you to distraction, wrapped as it was in that scintillating outfit, and yet, you never truly felt like she was looking at you, but rather, as if she were staring through you, peering into the depths of your soul. Those were the rumors, and Naruto hadn't until now The genin hadn't given them much thought. Until now. Until now, Naruto hadn't felt those sinister shades of scarlet boring into his back. And now, that he did, it didn't exactly leave him feeling comfortable. Skittish. Nervous. These were the things he felt, and he took little comfort from them. Though he wasn't at the head of the group, he almost wished he was, just to escape the woman's scathing glare. Had he done something to upset her? He couldn't remember. What had he done to rouse her wrath so? He'd reported to the gates first thing this morning, waited for everyone to arrive, then set out with them. Perhaps, because he was the odd man out. Everyone already had their squad assignment long before he begged to join the mission, and as such, he was essentially the odd man out stuck in Anko's group at the last minute. You seem distracted, Naruto-kun. What? He blinked when the devil had she snuck up on him, suddenly aware of the Jounin's presence. She was at his elbow, matching him stride for stride, crimson orbs peering into his sapphire. Naruto sputtered a hair's breadth longer, fumbling for a response. I'm not distracted. He lied through his teeth. I'm perfectly focused. That's me. The picture of focus. The Jounin arched a dark brow at his blasé attitude, but did not reproach him for it. Instead, and much to his disbelief, she continued the conversation. You're looking forward to seeing your homeland, I trust? She asked. Konoha is my homeland, the blonde argued, but his protest was weak. He'd been born in the village, just as everyone else, and yet, he couldn't help but feel alienated at times. Not just because of his tenant, he'd long since accepted that part of himself, but because he knew next to nothing of himself. Of course he knew who he was, but he had little to no idea where he'd come from. Where his parents had come from. The only tie he had to his past was his surname, Izumaki. And by the gods, he was going to learn about them. His clan. Of course he was looking forward to it. Yeah, I guess. He relented. It'd be nice to learn about my parents. Where they came from, who they were. Even if that means changing the very fabric of your destiny? What? The question was so soft, so sudden, so startling that it took Naruto's breath away. Had he truly heard her say that? Did you say something, Kurena-sensei? No, she shook her head, her face dimpling into a frown. It's nothing. You just seem distracted. Naruto squirmed restlessly beneath her gaze, suddenly uncertain of what he should say. How should he put it? Yes, I am distracted, sensei. Very distracted. Why? Because you've been glaring bloody red daggers at me ever since we left the village gates. Yet he daren't say that. Not aloud. Kurena was well known for her reputation as the Ice Queen of Konoha, and just as well. She made mincemeat out of lesser men than him, and he had no desire to become her next victim. Naruto did not. And maybe we should just focus on the mission? He ventured, looking for an opportunity to escape. Perhaps you're right. She nodded, the slightest of smiles pulling at her lips as she turned her face aside. We can discuss this later. Naruto nearly missed a step, stumbling on the road. Later? Are you adverse to speaking with me further? Kurena asked archly, never missing a beat. No. Naruto shouted, abruptly abashed by the looks of his fellow shinobi as they locked upon him. I mean, no, he said, softly this time. I wouldn't mind. It's just that. We've never really talked like this before. Is that so? The raven-haired woman surprised him by blinking just then, a look of genuine albeit quiet shock blossoming across her delicate features. She touched a finger to her chin in thought, eyes drifting shut for the span of 2 beats. I was certain I'd spoken with you at least once before. She shrugged to herself, slim shoulders rising and falling, dismissing whatever he'd been about to say. We will have to remedy that in the near future then. Her eyes left the unspoken question, and for a moment, he faltered. I'm asking you if you would like to speak with me later, Naruto-kun. She smiled then, and it was not the stiff, uncaring smile to which he'd been accustomed. It was a true smile, full of warmth and kindness and just a hint of something else. It was gone before he could think twice on it, leaving him to wonder if it had ever been. I'd like that. As would I. She nodded curtly and stepped away, the warmth gone from her face, replaced by those dispassionate rubies once more. Naruto was left scratching his head as the Jounin abruptly fell back, retreating towards her students, falling in conversation with them as though nothing had ever happened. What the hell did just happen? The so-called Ice Queen of Konoha had suddenly taken an interest in him? Of all people? He shook his head, dismissing the thought, dismissing the memory. End flashback. Once more Darth Carr crawled from the coffin of flesh and sex that was his bed. No amount of passion and ecstasy would keep him from getting dressed this time. He stepped to the dresser and reached for his robes. A stray thought ushered them into the air and over his shoulders, the force bending before his will as he donned the black garment and traditional body armor in slow succession. He thought back on his memories of that crimson-eyed Jonin, of Kurena Yui, how she had been the first one to lead him down the dark path. Whether or not that had been her intent at the time remained to be seen. As she promised, they had talked over the campfire that very night. Just talked. Nothing special. They spoke of simple things, his likes, her dislikes, his favorite foods, her preferred training methods. Nothing more. And when he woke on the next morn to find himself alone in his tent, and could not remember how he had gotten there, he thought nothing of it. The idea that a woman had taken interest in him for whatever reason was so ludicrous, so absurd, he hadn't even bothered to consider it, let alone given it thought. And yet, after their initial conversation, there came another. And another. And still another. They spoke each night, when they made camp, for their journey to the land of whirlpools was indeed a long one. Conversation was clearly a foreign thing for the Jounin, and yet, always she seemed to smile whenever Naruto delved into personal matters, whenever he made a mention of his supposed heritage or his parents. At the time, he had thought she was merely being polite. Now, Carr knew better. He knew now what his younger self did not, knew to read one's body and prepare oneself for whatever reaction one's words might produce. And as he knew now, he chastised his young self for his own ignorance. Kurena had been leading him on. Slowly, Naruto began to notice things about her. How she would occasionally touch a hand to his, the way seemed to lean forward whenever he spoke, presenting him with ample chance to do something his younger self wouldn't have dared contemplate. It took some time for him to realize that it was she who brought him back to his tent when he fell asleep at the fire, and during this time his consciousness began to spread outward at an alarming pace. His tunnel vision receded. Saw the world. Noticed things. Became aware. Hinata, for one. She often risked a glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Yet even with his newfound awareness, he couldn't help but wonder why. He tried to ask her about it once, but her face flushed a grand crimson color and she fainted dead away. Naruto stopped trying after that. Whatever it was, she'd tell him when she was ready. He certainly wasn't going to keep asking if she kept fainting. He also became aware of the others during this time, noticing how Kiba and Shino, and most notably Hinata, would stare at him at times in disbelief, other times outright sorrowed confusion as they conversed. He didn't at all find it odd back then that he mostly chatted with Kurena during the entirety of their journey. The occasional glance and bemused smirk from Anko told him she actually suspected what was happening, and would enjoy every moment of his discomfort. Gradually, he ceased to care about that too. He found himself looking forward to each night when they turned in, found himself delighting in the conversations with a woman he'd once thought to be an ice queen. He'd been wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. If Kurena was a queen of anything, she was a queen of fire. When she meant something, when she spoke to him with such enthusiasm, her eyes practically swam in lakes of flames and heat. And then one night, their conversations changed. Kurena began to speak to him of something more. Not of jutsu nor likes or dislikes or even her past. She spoke to him of the Force. An energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together. She told him. It was much like chakra in a sense that anyone could have it, but it was not something you acquired through years of training, not at all. Then she showed him, shocked him, levitated a rock in the palm of her hand as though it were not, but a feather. It was something you must be born with, she said. She was a mere novice in its ways, able to perform the slightest of tricks, despite her aberrant lack of training. What she told him next proved to be even more astounding. She believed he too held this power. Nearly the whole of the Uzumaki clan was composed of these force wielders shortly before being wiped out by a strange epidemic and war decades before. Bah! Darth Carr scoffed at the concept now. For he alone knew the truth. There had been no epidemic to cripple the Uzumaki, nor was there ever any war to end them. His clan had been destroyed by the Jedi. How? The only way a clan of Force users could be obliterated by brutal orbital bombardment, exterminated because they refused to adhere to the principles of the light. The Jedi claimed there could be no gray, only the light and dark, and in that they were correct. In the end, there would be only one, the dark side. His dark side. The Jedi had already come for him once before, and doubtless they would come many times more. But Darth Carr would not take vengeance upon them. Not yet. He would not throw himself at their sabers and die a swift death as they hoped. Oh no, his would be a much sweeter revenge. He would speak with these Jedi, these so-called protectors of peace. Parley. Confuse them. Baffle them. Bleed them of their very best, and then and only then, when their order was in ashes and the universe loathed their very existence, would they have his permission to die. And these so-called Sith that still dwelt out there. He had plans for them as well. Brooding again, Lord Carr. Carr blinked his surprise, momentarily alarmed to feel a pair of pale arms coil around his waist, winding themselves around his chest. He suppressed a smile, as he felt her breath against his neck, her lips teasing at his ear. He did not need the power of the Force nor that of the dark side to know who it was that nestled against him. A sage Ventress, former apprentice of Darth Tyrannus formerly known as Count Dooku, nuzzled her head into his neck, her pale features contrasting sharply with that of his tan visage. She was as lovely as death itself, and twice as deadly. Ventress. He smiled. I was unaware you'd returned. He turned in her arms, regarding the live woman with intent. I trust the rebellion in Rice Country has been put down. Her dark lips twisted in a small smile as they sought his. I took great pleasure in it. Carr gave himself to the kiss, savoring her tongue over hers. Cammy, how he'd missed her. And the heads of the resistance? He asked. Mounted on the main gate, my lord. Naruto grinned. If there anyone who truly brought out the darkness within him, it was Ventress. The others merely stirred it in him, gaining faint glimpses of his power. But Ventress. He felt the twitch in his hand again as he looked over her, the thrill for battle coursing through his blood. He smiled. What say you to a spar then? Having finished dressing himself, he reached now for the twin handles of the sabers at his belt, welcoming their cold handles as he made for the door. Ventress's eyes all but glittered as she followed after him, favoring her own blades, as they descended to the training pad many levels below. Let the lady sleep a while, she mused, favoring her master's strong shoulders through the thick cloak he wore, violet eyes trailing over his frame. Today, he is mine. And after? She purred. That depends. Carr restrained a smile. Cammy, these women were insatiable. I would be delighted. Carr laughed. He'd taken great pleasure in wresting her away from the Count, though the effort had nearly cost him his life. Dooku was not a man to trifle with lightly, and though it was a coup stealing away his precious protege, Carr knew he would one day have to face the wrath of Tyrannus and through him his master for the constant interference he wrought between the two Sith. The thought of the two men and their machinations rankled Darth Carr to no end. There would be only one Dark Lord of the Sith. Not some pair of feeble old men with grandiose dreams they could not grasp. He could not claim to have been pure until that day. Her certainly wasn't now, but what mistakes he did make were often made in ignorance back then, not of sinister intent. He did not delight in pleasure and passion as he did now, nay, back then he'd all but shunned them. That day that mission had changed everything. Before that day, always he had suspected, secretly had he feared that he wasn't like the others. He knew Kurena wasn't like them either, but in a cold, frigid way always known to him on a fundamental level, always there, yet always different. Her abrupt approach that first day had stirred something deep within him, set something loose. Until that moment, he'd never thought much of women. Sure, some were attractive, but he'd never thought of them like that. Kurena had changed all of that. And for a time he'd been content with it. A friend, nothing more. But when they reached the ruins, everything changed. Time seemed to slow, a single sliver stretching into eternity. He watched as the lower wall crumbled, the massive column of stone finally giving into gravity and plummeting towards them. His body was already moving, flinging itself backwards even as he registered the danger, his sensitive hearing all that saved his life. Kurena held no such advantage. To his infinite horror and dismay, the genin looked on as the pillar crashed down upon the jounin, crushing her to a bloody pulp beneath its weight. No. He screamed, and it felt as if another were screaming with him. No. He never should have touched that wall, never should have walked around without checking for traps, never should have minus. He blinked, and the scene was gone. A Vicen. Kurena stood stock still staring at the manuscript in her hands in rapt fascination. Naruto swung around in mid-leap, gawping at the pillar that had only just begun to fall like a leaning tower, mocking him as its foundation crumbled, toppling toward the raven-haired woman who was beginning to capture his heart. And Naruto was still flying backwards in retreat, still being carried by the momentum from his first leap. Naruto tried to cry out, but he was moving slowly, much too slowly. There was no way he could save her from here. Even he wasn't that fast. Even if he ran toward her now, he'd reach her just in time for her to become so much bloody paste upon the ground. Naruto recognized, processed, and reacted to this information in a fraction of a second. Time trickled forward, and the moment was lost, the debris hurtling toward their heads. No. His soul screamed, shrieking its fury, as the pillar plummeted. No, no, no. No. He flung a hand forward, palm outward, fingers splayed, as if by the mere exertion of his will he could somehow save her, prevent her untimely end. As fate would have it, something did. Naruto felt his anger envelop him and fly from his fingertips, surging toward Kurena like an invisible missile, a bullet of compacted force and energy. She seemed to sense some manner of something because she looked right at him, ignoring the still falling stones, the chunks of rock screaming toward her head, unaware of its own impending end. And then the jounin was gone, and across the courtyard, shoved, pushed as though an invisible hand had taken hold of them, throwing her bodies through the air like a pair of rag dolls. She hit the ground in a controlled roll and sprang to her feet, crouched tense in a defensive stance, and still her eyes never left his. Numbed, Naruto lowered his arm, and the power left him, the rippling of the air the only indication that he'd done anything at all. But what did it matter? She was safe, and that was all that truly mattered. He heaved a sigh of relief, his shoulders sagging, drained from the effort. He'd blown apart a section of the wall with his exertions, and now he balked as he beheld was lurked behind the ruined rock. Hanging there before him like some kind of cosmic jewel. A cube. He stared at it, rooted in place by the sight of it. Naruto. Ino's voice pierced his reverie like a lance, drawing him back to the present. Her dumbfounded expression said it all, demanding an explanation for what he'd just done. Before he could give one, the ground gave way beneath the cube. Beneath him. There could be no other word for it. The broken tiles at his feet simply ceased to be, the earth splitting beneath him in a ragged oval. The genin balked as his footing disappeared, leaving him hanging over the abyss. He flailed in surprise, his hands seeking a handhold, but there was nothing to grab. The last sight he had was of their horrified faces, of their hands, reaching out for him. And then he fell. He plummeted, plunging deep into darkness. He fell. And thus literally and physically his fall began. Chapter 3: Descent. Killing someone. If they threaten me, I might just do that. Uzumaki Naruto, soon to be Dark Lord of the Sith. Descent. Darth Bane. Responsible for the destruction of Brotherhood of Darkness on Ryusan. creator of the rule of two. A great god of a man, the specter of 1,000 legends, whose name still invokes nightmares of dread to this very day. Carr found it ironic that the one who contributed to his fall was the same man whose teachings he would later reject. One to embody the power, one to crave it. He scoffed at such a thing. Such a system was built upon betrayal, were he to have followed such a rule he'd have but a single apprentice, and they'd doubtlessly have killed one another by now. No, Carr did not follow the rule of two. He followed the rule of many. There would be only one Dark Lord of the Sith, a powerful pinnacle to which all others would strive, bettering one another, honing their skills. And when death finally took him, when he was ushered into that cold abyss and his chosen successor accepted the mantle of Dark Lord of the Sith, well, Carr didn't plan on dying for quite some time. Carr briefly toyed with the idea of taking on another apprentice. Already he taught 6 and Nayla was swiftly shaping up to become the 7th. The young Twi'lek still had yet to fully release her emotions as the others had. Her eyes had yet to take on the distinctive golden hue of the true Sith, but neither were they the milky saffron color of his own. Were he to look at himself in the mirror now, he would marvel at himself. He was so different. So fierce. The 16-year-old boy he'd been after the Shinobi Wars was gone now, replaced by a frozen monolith who cared for little save himself. Amongst them, his wives, apprentices and servants, but little else. The rest of the universe. Well, they could go burn for all he cared. Darth Carr hazarded a glance at himself in the polished durasteel walls as he descended to the training ground below. Indeed, to see himself now, one would scarcely recognize him. His shaggy blonde hair and thick whiskers remained from his days as a shinobi as Uzumaki Naruto, but precious little else could be associated with that name. For one, there were the scars. They lined the length of his neck, the pale flesh a constant reminder of Sakura's betrayal, of how close she'd come to ending his life after he'd slain Sasuke at the climax of their epic battle. Until that day he'd never doubted her, never, though she'd be so bold as to try and strike at him in his sleep. Looking back, he'd been a fool to trust her. His reign had nearly ended that night. Were not for the regenerative prowesses granted him by that of his tenant, all his work would have been undone. And all because of a foolish childhood crush. A Sith did not make such mistakes, his master said, and thus Naruto took action. Sakura's missing fingers would always serve as a constant reminder of her betrayal. He'd only taken the unimportant ones, he couldn't very well have her work suffering now, could he? And still, he stared into the mirror. Saffron eyes blazed balefully back at him, yet another sign of all he had done. All he had accomplished. Since finding that old holocron, he'd slain countless shinobi, establishing his rule over the planet with an iron fist. He took on countless apprentices both from his world, and others venturous amongst them. He stole a glance at her, the night sister at his elbow. She caught his gaze and held it for a mere moment, shying aside as he looked on. Strange. It was not like her to shy away from his gaze. He'd been the same once. Shy and skittish, fearful of these strange new powers that were being made manifest in him. So long ago. Flashback. The dull buzz of voices pulled Naruto out of the blackness. At first he heard the voices only as garbled nonsense, the rise and fall of pitch and timbre, not words. The stabs of pain in his ribs, head and nose sharpened as his mind began to clear. Who? What? When? Where? When? He remembered what had happened. He forced his eyes open and looked on dim surroundings. Darkness. He had fallen. The sun overhead cast only a slight glow through the debris darkened by looming clouds. He tried focus through blurry vision, a feat easier said than done. His head throbbed with pain, blunting his concentration. Something was shining, glowing, just out of his reach. Something red. Crimson. More words, something about pain, about understanding. A man's voice. Touch the pyramid, apprentice. Blue eyes burst open. He was on the floor, sprawled across the dirt, left to rot in the dust. In the darkness. So heavy. He wanted to move, needed to move. Now. Propping himself up on his elbows, the genin strangled a groan. He reached out into the darkness, his fingers searching, closing around that light, the strange pyramid from before. He pulled it closer to his face, its dim radiance his sole source of light in the darkness. He marveled at it. How could something so small cause him so much trouble? He tried to stand to rise, smacked his head on the low ceiling. Ouch! He winced, realizing he was in an outer passage. Pulling the pyramid close to his chest, he held it forth before him. Odd, was it glowing brighter than before? Steeling himself, he plunged into the darkness. The ground sloped beneath his feet, carrying him down, deeper into the depths of the catacombs. It was as if he had awoken in the belly of a beast, each step bringing him closer to its old and dread. All right, his voice climbed as he spoke as he descended, so I'm stuck in this creep cavern with this creepy pyramid and yow. He yelped as the device came to life in his hands, nearly dropping the crimson pyramid to the floor. Fumbling fingers closed around it at the last second, preventing its destruction. Naruto heaved a heavy sigh of relief. Whatever this strange device was, it undoubtedly held the secret to unlocking that strange power he'd wielded earlier. He was about to continue on when the pyramid beeped. This time Naruto failed to catch it, sending the device clattering to the floor, its triangular facets skittering down the slope and away from him as he struggled to catch up. He nearly tripped as the ground leveled out, his sandals striking the bare floor, and even then he wasn't swift enough to prevent his face from caroming off a large metal door. A singular figure erupted from its facets, a great mountain of a man as large as he was tall. Wreathed in eerie blue light as he was, it took Naruto a few moments to realize this was not so much a ghost as it was a projection, broadcasting an old image of a man no longer amongst the living. "Welcome, young apprentice," said man boomed, his tinny voice crashing like thunder against a hillock. "My name is Darth Bane. What do you wish to learn? The art of the blade? The way of the warrior? Or perhaps you seek knowledge of a darker sort?" Taking Naruto's silence as an answer, he continued onward. "Some possess raw elemental power, they can unleash storms of lightning from their fingertips. Do you seek to learn how to wield such power?" Naruto balked at the hologram. "Learn." A frown marred the man's heavy brow. "Surely you've called upon my knowledge for a reason." "Well, actually, my patience wears thin," he growled. "Do you wish to learn, or not?" I do." Naruto was always willing to learn new things, but this would prove to be something else entirely. He simply had no idea of the darkness in which he was dabbling. "Then select a subject." Bane bit out. Naruto flinched. The man might not be present, but his ire most certainly was. Unable to think, the blonde made a small noise of amazement, and selected the first thing that came to mind. And as he made it, he felt something. Not so much as a stirring in himself, but beyond himself, an act whose consequences would be felt by the legions of this world and many others, countless times over. Force lightning. There was a silence. "You dabble in the dark arts, I see." Bane surmised with a small smile, his rage vanishing as though it had never been. "Very well. I shall instruct you on the aspects of Sith lightning. Listen well, and heed my words." Abruptly, Bane vanished. Only his voice remained, pursued by a wall of text, rising from the holocron itself. A Jedi sufficiently strong in the Force can be trained to produce a facsimile, but not true Sith lightning, which unabated has the power not only to incapacitate or kill, but to physically transform the victim. Force lightning requires strength of a sort only a Sith can command, because we accept consequence and reject compassion. To do so requires a thirst for power that is not easily satisfied. The Force tries to resist the callings of ravenous spirits, therefore it must be broken, and made a beast of burden. It must be made to answer one's will. But the Force cannot be treated deferentially. In order to summon and use lightning properly, you will someday have to be on the receiving end of its power, as a means of taking the energy inside yourself. Naruto gawped. That was a lot to take in. Can I learn them? The basics will be simple to learn if you have the desire, yes. I like simple, Naruto replied lightly, sighing into the air. It's my blanket of comfort in a world of insanity. A tiny smile broke out on Bane's chiseled face, like a crack etching along a stone surface. Seemed the holocron had a sense of humor after all. Then learn you shall. He folded both arms behind his back and drew himself to his full towering height. First, I shall teach you the very essence of our order, that is to say, the code of the Sith itself. Repeat after me, apprentice. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Now, repeat. Naruto felt a growing sense of trepidation swell within him as the Dark Lord began to instruct him. He also felt something he hadn't felt since he'd first met the Kyuubi. Fear. But Naruto was nothing if not stubborn. He'd mastered the Kage Bunshin, a Jounin-level technique, in little to no time. Surely this couldn't be so hard. It might even help him become Hokage. But was peace truly a lie? There would always be war, always conflict, he knew that now. Obito had been right in that aspect. But for peace to be called an outright lie, after all that had happened, even after Neji's death. Perhaps it was, after all. Peace is a lie. Ha! And thus, his fall continued. When the voices called for him some time later, he opened his eyes. How long had he been trapped down here? Alone in the dark? Days? Weeks? Months? Certainly it hadn't been a year. Or had it? No, that wasn't possible. He couldn't have survived a year down here without food, he'd surely have perished by then. The walls of the cavern were charred beyond recognition, as though a great flame had swept through the bowels of the room and devoured everything. In truth, there had been no flame, but only Naruto knew of that. The door remained wedged firmly shut, barring him his passage. He knew its runic features would not open for just anyone, only a true master of the way of the Sith could hope to part these doors. But could he ever hope to become one? Naruto had his doubts. While he would try and fight were necessary, he was not inherently cruel by nature. He just couldn't see himself that way. Not yet. Naruto. A voice called from above the slope. Are you down there? Naruto bristled. That was Kurena's voice. He froze, his features twisted in surprise. Can't let her see it. Already, he could hear her footsteps coming closer, the skittering of stone as she descended the slope. He had mere moments. Fumbling with the holocron, he shoved it into a storage scroll. And not a moment too soon. Naruto looked up as light pieced the darkness, squinting against it. Seconds thereafter, he felt a hand upon his shoulder, felt slim arms pulling him into an embrace. Naruto froze, suddenly aware of her breasts pushing into his chest, of her breath, warm on his neck. He'd never been embraced by a woman, let alone one as beautiful as Kurena, not a once. Looks like you found what you were looking for, she whispered in his ear. Naruto stiffened, rooted by her words. What did she mean? At the time, he didn't know. What he did know was thus, Bane had been right. Peace was a lie. There is only passion. Carr faced Ventress upon the private grounds of his training arena, more akin to a flat stretch of space than anything else, a spacious area surrounded by four walls and a high ceiling. It was here that the former shinobi raised a single saber in salute towards his apprentice. Come. He beckoned. A sachie flew at him like an arrow loose from a bow, her twin lightsabers carving crimson swathes of destruction as they struck the floor, then the wall, then the ceiling, each time coming perilously close to his face, but never close enough. Naruto was a blur, a specter, a ghost, never in one place for more than an instant, forcing Ventress to hound him back and forth across the arena. The game was an old one, and one master and student relished in. They raged back and forth across the training grounds like the Sith lords of old, leaving naught but destruction in their wake, uncaring for anything else save one note. Ventress moved like a human hurricane, always striking, always moving, seeking out his weaknesses and exploiting them whenever the opportunity arose. And yet, today, her aggression lacked focus. She struck hard with both sabers, rocking him back on one heel, but there was little to no strength behind the blow. Carr frowned at her over the crimson line of his own blade. Today, she was making great efforts to protect her abdomen, always shielding her stomach with a single saber whenever he came too close. Which was quite often. Her usual enthusiasm seemed to wither away as he pressed the attack, resolved that he might somehow discover whatever it was that maladied the pristine precision of her strikes. Naruto blinked and fell into the Force vision. Again. Naruto Carr barked out the words as he brought the long handle of his saber crashing down at the ground. He pressed the attack relentlessly, his features grim, as he forced his opponent, a boy of roughly 10 years, backwards. The lad gave ground all too easily, his features indistinct in the Force, his crimson saber a frantic blur, as he struggled to break through the ward of the Dark Lord's feints and parries, but to no avail. A Force push ended it, sending him sprawling out of the practice ring. He struggled to stand and froze as the tip of a lightsaber found his neck. "Go see the healer." Naruto barked dismissively, shutting the weapon down. "She'll tend your wounds." "Why, yes, sir." Carr watched the lad retreat with a touch of regret, and shook his head. He was a Sith. He should be out conquering the galaxy, not training children. He really was getting too old for this. Laughter tittered across their field of hearing, and he looked down to see a little waif of a girl standing at his feet. She was a youngling, couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and yet he felt a warm smile blossom upon his features as he saw her. It was as if God had taken the best of him and Ventress and mixed them together in this beautiful little girl. "Well now, who do we have here?" Raven locks lofted around a heart-shaped face, her pale skin not so much pale as her mother's, contrasting flawlessly with her rustic style of clothing and crimson garb. A single training saber dangled at her hip, her forehead still slicked with sweat from her morning routine. How did he know that? "Daddy," she chirruped happily, reaching up for him with outstretched arms. Naruto reached down and snatched his daughter off the ground, swung her into his chest, his laughter fading into the distance, taking the world with it. Carr staggered, wincing, as his Ventress's lightsaber sliced across his cheek, nearly taking his face off. Carr spat a curse and flung her backwards with the Force, a second saber roaring to life in his hand. Sweat slicked across his brow, his brief gleam of the future had cost him dearly. He glared at Ventress a moment longer, struggling to quell his fury. How dare she keep a secret like this from him? How dare she? Enough. He shut the blades down and clipped them back to his belt. "We're done for the day." His tone brooked no answer or argument, but to his ire, his pale apprentice persisted. "The Jedi are here, master." She sheathed her blades as well, the bloodlust palpable in her eyes. "I will accompany you." "No," Naruto's voice descended into a snarl, leaving all trace of emotion behind. "For now, they believe I'm the only threat. If they were to see you, I can hold my own." Ventress frowned, her expression thunderous. "Of that I am certain." Carr immediately moved to close off that avenue, knowing that it was a wasted effort where his proud apprentice was concerned. "However, I will not risk your safety on a whim. Nor that of my legacy." For the first time since her return, the Night Sister's pale face drained of all color, only to brighten immediately thereafter. The slow flushing of her face was like a burning forest fire spreading to every inch of her body. Both hands flew to her stomach in a heartbeat, fingers reflexively curling around the still-toned surface as though she could somehow protect the tiny life stirring within. As if she could somehow shield it from scrutiny. "When did you?" Carr smiled then, and it was a warm smile, a human smile, not that of a Sith Lord's. He took her hand in his and kissed it, his head traveling down her abdomen, pressing an ear against her stomach. "Just now." He paused, as though listening to the currents of life itself. "The Force spoke to me. It will be a girl, I think." He chortled softly, and it was a dangerous chuckle. "Do not keep such secrets from me then. You know how I despise such lies, you know." Despite herself, and all the years she'd known him, Ventress flushed. She was not yet accustomed to this strange Sith and his equally strange ways, though she had willingly turned against Count Dooku for him without a second thought. Sith above all else, held power in high regard. And Lord Carr was stronger than the Count. The Force told her he would become stronger still, as would the small life growing within her stomach. At the thought of that of her child, Ventress felt fiercely furious. No one would harm her child. Not a Jedi, not a Sith. No one. These feelings, strange though they were, did not frighten her. They excited her. Carr. The Sith Lord paused in midstread, curiously regarding her over his shoulder. To fall in love is not something to be frowned upon. Ventress murmured. You told me that. It is. To be cherished. To be able to love each other, to hold a son, or a daughter, or both in one's hands to raise a family. That isn't something that should be taken away. She paused, staring at him, steely-eyed, awaiting his answer. Those were my words, yes. Ventress's mouth worked wordlessly for the longest moment, struggling to form the words she'd never before spoken to anyone. Never had thought to speak, never dared to speak to anyone. Be safe. She managed at last, bowing. My lord. Love you too, Ven. Carr's voice slipped into his old dialect for a moment, his gaze holding hers. The sight of her face burning was the sweetest thing in the world, and he reveled in it, basking in the glory of his newfound knowledge. He was going to be a father. Were any of the others pregnant? Were they too, keeping secrets from him? Carr silently resolved to seek the truth once he resolved these matters with the Jedi. Without another word he took the final step outside, and into the light. There was more than one ambassador, he was pleased to realize. Both were female. The first, a young Zabrakian, hung back behind the second, a Togrutan Jedi, her rusty skin tone darkened, her gray lips pursed, whether from anger or embarrassment, Carr knew not. They watched him intently as he descended the stairwell, and he them. Interesting that they would send these two to negotiate with him. Shaak Ti. The Togrutan Jedi Master was a fearsome foe and not one tackled lightly, even for a Sith Lord such as himself. Part of him relished the challenge. The other part, curious, would have been the best description. And then there was the matter of her apprentice. Naruto's gaze swung towards the female Zabrak, taking her in at a glance. What he found there pleased him. Although she was pleasing to the eye, it was her turmoil of emotion raging within her breast that truly attracted him. Emerald eyes burned back at him, jade fire licking at the edges of her irises as though she could slay him merely through the act of staring. Naruto bit back a grin. There was anger in this one. Hatred. Fury trapped just beneath the surface, biding its time, waiting for the moment to strike. Interesting. I bid you welcome, Master Jedi. Carr inclined his head politely, suppressing any and all disdain he felt for the servants of the light. Your presence here honors me. Shaak Ti cocked her head aside, contemplating him. Even in his dark robe, he looked very little the part of a Sith Lord, just as he'd intended. Intimidation was but one of the many weapons wielded the like of the Sith arsenal, but negotiations could not proceed when the other party was too concerned with their own safety. Those soft brown eyes softened, just a millimeter. I wish we could say the same, Sith. She answered demurely. Come now, let us not use such labels. Carr waved her words away with an errant wave of his gloved hand, amused at their reactions. Both women flinched, as though expecting him to lunge at them in any instant. Did they think him a fool? He saw no reason to attack them outright, it would only bring more Jedi down on his head. Instead he gathered himself, directing an earnest stare towards the confines of their ship. I understand you have something of mine. And you have someone of ours. Shaak Ti countered. Golden eyes twinkled softly, but whatever answer he might have given was caught up in a heart-stopping hiss. Cut the crap, sick spawn. Naruto's gaze swung back towards the female Zabrak, bemused by her reaction. Whatever do you mean? I mean, give us Layla back, you bastard. Maris, Shaak Ti warned, control your anger. Naruto sighed. Her anger is understandable. Alas, Layla does not wish to return at this time. Because you turned her. The Padawan accused, spitting venom. You corrupted her with your wicked ways, and lured her away from the light just as you did to Barris. You monster. You prey upon the weak. I do not prey. The Sith scoffed. I extend my hand to those of less fortune than myself and offer them a place at my side. If that is what you call preying upon the weak, Jedi, then I am most certainly guilty of that crime. Stop that. Stop what? I said stop. Maris. He's lying, master. She argued, biting her lower lip. He has to be. No, my young Padawan. Car cut her off, his words a low growl. That is where you are wrong. They did not come to me seeking to silence the Sith as your kind always have. They came to me seeking answers to their questions. They wanted to know who I was. What I was. They were full of questions. So many questions, so unlike your kind. But they could not hope to understand the scope of my vision. No. No. And when they failed to understand, they too tried to strike me down. I could have killed them for that. Instead, I showed them mercy and gave them a place at my side, a chance to experience something your kind shuns, like the plague. Emotion. Passion. Power. Euphoria in the simplest of terms. What you fail to understand is thus, I am like no Sith Lord you've ever seen. Strike me down if you've seen otherwise. No. Maris's shriek split the sky, accompanied by a force push so violent, it ripped the earth itself. Carr nudged it aside as thought it were not, but an errant breeze, ruffling his hair. It is not in my nature to return those who do not wish to be returned. You lie. Trembling, she reached for her hilt. Sith spit. You taint the air with your very tongue. Maris, Shaak Ti's voice climbed higher still. Do not do this. I'm sorry, master, but I have to do this. We can't let the Sith exist. Not when one's standing right in front of us. Maris's lightsaber ignited with an eclectic snap, hiss, a rumble of thunder tearing through the silence as she raised the blade and held it between them, a green line she would not allow the Sith Lord to cross. You turn your weapon on me. Carr frowned, grasping the long handle of his own lightsaber and activating the blade. You are but a child, fumbling in matters you cannot hope to comprehend. Allow me to educate you. It sprang forth like a genie from the bottle, a bolt of brilliant red-white, accompanied by a flash of radiant thunder. The sword sang in his hand, not a mere tool, but an extension of his self. Maris. Shaak Ti's voice had lost all hint of reproach. She now spoke with the full weight and authority of a Jedi master. You will stand down this instant. Her Padawan blanched briefly, cowed by the force behind her words, and for a moment the fate of the duel lay in jeopardy. Carr made a sound of supreme annoyance, much to the surprise of all others present. Come now, Master Jedi, do you honestly think I intend to kill your student before your very eyes? He shook his head, slowly making his intentions clear. I merely intend to teach her a lesson to prove I am not the Sith you seek. And if she falls, well then she falls. Lightning licked across his fingertips. My apologies, but I'll be removing you from out little dance now. With a thunderous crackle the bolts flew forward. Shaak Ti dodged too late and the energy struck her, put a cold spike in her heart and threw her against the far wall. Despite the agony, she managed to use the force to cushion her impact and fell to the floor, her breathing ragged as the last of their sparks crawled over her and expired. She did not rise. Master. Maris screamed. What will you do now, young Padawan? Carr mocked. If you do not defeat me, your master will never receive the medical treatment she so sorely needs. She might even die. The Zabrak hissed at him. You. Carr moved the blade back and forth as he sized up his opponent, contemplating the fiery Padawan stance as she held her ground against him. Aha, he mused, so she favored the defensive form 3 sorcery. His teachers had easily demonstrated the weaknesses of that form, and he knew them all too well. Carr lowered his single saber in a salute, the blade raised toward the native sky of Ninjato. He smiled. Time is ticking, Padawan. Brood balked at his unorthodox style a moment longer, then she leapt forward, shrieking her fury. She swooped at Carr, her face a rictus of rage as the Sith Lord languidly lowered his blade to block. Die. Maris's blade spat a blurry shower of sparks as she unleashed a series of powerful blows, her anger and aggravation lending strength to each strike. Naruto allowed the strength of the attacks to move him backwards as he dodged left, right, leapt, spun and parried, biding his time. At last he deflected an overhand strike in a shower of energy, slid his blade free, and stabbed at Maris's middle. To her credit and his own amusement, the Padawan slid left, spun, and drove Car's blade to the earth with another overhand strike. Maris threw a reverse elbow with her off arm, augmented with the strength of the force, but Car anticipated the blow, parried with his forearm, lurched his blade free, and drove a force-augmented kick into Maris's midsection. Oof. The impact lifted Maris from her feet and drove her 15 paces back across the pad, though she flipped in flight and landed on her feet in a crouch, clutching at her stomach. "I find your lack of faith disturbing, Padawan," Car said, advancing on her as she struggled to catch her breath. "Were you a student of mine, you would not be so weak." "Shut up." Maris shrieked and launched herself at him in a forward somersault, her saber screaming for his head. Car scoffed and slapped the Padawan's lightsaber aside with almost contemptuous ease. A force push sent her stumbling to the right and past him. She wheeled and he nudged her aside yet again, as though she were a bull and he the matador. Her eyes blazed at him with each failed pass. He was toying with her. Her skin darkened, flush with fury. "Yes, that is," he goaded. "Use your anger." "Enough." Car blinked as Shaak Ti's lightsaber abruptly twitched on the ground beside him. This was the only warning he received, and then the blade flew across the landing field and slapped in the awaiting palm Darth Brood. There came a deafening snap, hiss, a bolt of brilliant blue-white blazing beside her green. Maris heaved a deep breath and welcomed the calm, immersing herself within the force once more. "There is no emotion. There is peace." "Impressive," Car noted. "But words won't save you." The Sith fell into the force as well as she came towards him, let its energy course through his body, enhance his reflexes, his strength, his endurance. He drew upon the memories of his pain and suffering, let his anger and hatred for the Jedi give him the power needed to prevail. Car answered Maris's stare with one of his own, his eyes black holes, and lightning sizzled on his fingertips, tracing a spiral path up the red blade of his lightsaber. "We end this," he said. Sith and Jedi strode across the landing zone toward each other, lethal purpose in both of their minds. Car found it refreshing to fight again, though he did not relish the idea of killing such a promising student. They collided like a hurricane. Jedi and Sith did, a typhoon of sapphire and scarlet and emerald green. Once more Car was in favor of defense, allowing himself to be driven ever backwards as the Padawan slashed and sliced and stabbed with her. "Maris." Car drew himself up to his full height and struck like a viper. Maris had less than an instant to recognize the sudden change in his stance, the anger in his eyes, and then her master's blade was gone, swatted from her hand like an errant bauble. It pirouetted in the air a moment longer, dangling overhead. Car raised his fist and crushed it in a force grip, reducing the venerable master's saber to scrap, raining metallic dust down on her head. It all happened too quickly for Maris to react. She felt her calm disintegrate with the destruction of her master's lightsaber. Car, sensing the hesitation, bounded forward, lightsaber raised in a killing stroke. Maris parried, but too slowly. Car's blade severed Maris's left arm at the elbow, slicing through flesh and bone like a hot knife through butter. Blinding pain exploded in Maris's mind, a scream broke through the wall of her gritted teeth. She felt herself fall, but as if from a distance. The world seemed to slow. Her senses felt attenuated, all except for the acute, throbbing agony of her arm. Her heart kept in time with the pulse of her doom, and each beat sent a knife of pain up her bicep. Car loomed over her, his lightsaber sizzling, his confidence the embodiment of Maris's failure. Anger tensed Maris's body, her cheeks darkening from pale ash to a grand crimson color. Blue force lightning gathered upon her fingertips, crackled a dire promise. Car redoubled his pace. He had not expected the Padawan to fall so easily, and in the presence of her master no less. Before he could reach her, Maris gestured, and the energy cut a jagged path across the pad towards him. Instead of leaping back to avoid the deadly attack, Naruto extinguished his saber and stepped forward to greet it. Both hands were held in front of him, his arms fully extended at shoulder height, his thumbs touching and his fingers splayed wide. He drew the bolts of lightning into his waiting grasp, channeling them away from their intended target and absorbing their power. "Allow me to show you, Padawan," he said to the disbelieving Zabrakian, the true power of the dark side. Maris's eyes went wide as Naruto unleashed the power of her own attack against her. She tried to throw up a force shield, but the bolts ripped it apart and continued unabated. The lightning engulfed her, the intense heat depriving her of her new defense, stripping her of his strength and forcing her to the floor. She lay there gasping, groaning, as the lightning scrawled across her flesh, leaving her helpless before the Sith Lord's brutal advance. "You have chosen the lonely path," Naruto sighed. "The Jedi teach denial of self. That is their weakness. Your weakness. No sentient can long abide that. The Sith embrace the self, whereas I embrace others, and therein lies my strength." "You preach much but you understand so little," Maris said, her words hoarse with pain. "The Jedi teach the interdependence of life. The understanding at all is connected to the greater good." A flash of anger animated Kar's eyes, and he spit at Maris's feet. "Now it is you who lie, Padawan. Did your precious order think of the greater good when they exterminated my clan nearly a century ago? Where were their morals then?" Maris gasped, but Kar bored deeper. "When is the last time you felt anything with passion? When is the last time you laughed, Maris? Felt the touch of a lover, of a loved one? When?" The words cut close to the bone, echoing as they did Maris's own doubts. Kar must have seen it in her expression, because he sheathed his blade and offered her his hand. "Join me." What? His offer had come too suddenly for her to contemplate refusal. He'd lowered his defenses. Every fiber of her being knew that this was the time to act, to strike him down, and yet a thorn of doubt pricked her and held her back. A Jedi must not strike down an unarmed opponent. "I am asking you to join me, Padawan," the Sith Lord repeated, his words soft as silk, smooth as satin. "You have potential. I am willing to take you under my wing and help you unlock it. You will be able to see Barriss and Mela again, and in time you will come to understand why they have joined me." Maris's mouth worked wordlessly. "Would you rather I threaten you?" Kar turned toward Shaak Ti, the Togrutan's chest still rose and fell with breath, but that could easily be ended with a single stroke of his lightsaber. He would do it, she realized. He would strike her down without so much as a second thought. Not even a backward glance would be spared for her corpse. A snake of dread coiled in the depths of Brood's gut, a snake of losing everything she had ever known. "No," she shouted, gaining the Sith Lord's attention. Then more softly, "No, please, don't kill her." "Your answer, then?" Those golden orbs blazed down at her. "Will you serve me, apprentice?" Maris inclined her head, hating the bitterness she felt, the tang of it on her tongue. "Forgive me, master." She prayed that her venerable teacher would understand why she had done this when she woke. "As you wish, my master." Kar's face brightened, the storm leaving his eyes. "Good girl." He snapped his fingers, and all at once Maris found herself surrounded by servants. Wait. That wasn't quite right, she realized. These men and women wore long flowing robes, their upper visage each hidden by half-helms, exposing only a grim line for their mouths and chins. These were not household servants. They were soldiers. Well-armed soldiers, as evidenced by the vibroblades at their hips and the repeating blasters slung across their backs. And was that Mandalorian armor they were wearing? "See to it that she receives a Bacta treatment at once and have that reattached," the Sith Lord instructed, gesticulating at the severed stump of Brood's old arm. "Padawan Maris Brood and her master Shaak Ti are to be treated as my honored guests until I say otherwise. I will not tolerate any harm to their person." "Troublesome," one of them muttered, displeasure trickling through his vocoder. "What was that, Shikimari?" Kar growled. Nothing." Maris might have giggled were she not so terrified. And she had only the word of a Sith Lord to cling to. A Sith. And Aleph, this had come about because of her, because she'd insisted on picking a fight with Said Sith. Honestly, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she clutched the stump of her arm and allowed herself to be led away. She risked a glance over her shoulder as the guards ushered her into the compound. The Sith Lord had yet to move from this landing, his gaze remained fixated upon her, boring into her, hissing her. Maris shivered as the doors slid shut behind them, finally putting something between her and his implacable gaze. The dark side was strong here, and yet there was a distinct lack of malice in the air. Somewhere on the upper tier, laughter trickled down to her. The Padawan clutched at the stump of her arm once more, feeling naked without her lightsaber. Why do I feel as though I've just made a deal with the devil? Car watched them go, clucked his tongue, and turned towards the still form of Shaak Ti. The Jedi Master would live whether he interfered or not, but it was best not to take any chances reaching down for her. He noted her thready pulse, no doubt he knew she would not look back fondly on this day. Even now he could sense his prize deep within the bowels of their ship, and knew what was waiting for him. A slow, sinister smile pulled at his lips. Negotiations had officially broken down. Again. Next time they wouldn't be sending a master and her Padawan. No, after this he probably warranted a visit from the Jedi Council themselves. That would prove interesting. For all they knew, he was a simple, single Sith, albeit a strong one. They knew nothing of his apprentices and wives, nothing of the family he was raising here in solitude. It seems your Padawan has yet to master the nuance of diplomacy, Shaak Ti. Car mused as he slung her slumbering form over his shoulder. But I am nothing if not a man of my word. He chuckled softly as he departed the landing pad. The council was truly foolish. For all he knew, they'd send Master Kenobi next time, perhaps even Skywalker. It mattered not. Sooner or later they were bound to learn. One simply did not send women to a Sith Lord's compound. Chapter 4, Countdown. Strength that is never touched by ruthlessness is touchingly irresponsible. Darth Vectavis. Countdown. Happy holidays, Master Jedi. All eyes swung toward the center of the council chamber in stunned disbelief, alarmed to find the likeness of Darth Karr, self-appointed Dark Lord of the Sith, standing before them. Where in the name of the Force had he come from? None had sensed so much as a disturbance in the Force had the Sith masked his presence so easily. Mere moments before they'd been discussing what to do about him, this secretive Sith who'd effortlessly eradicated the third Jedi strike team sent against him just last year. Though he was undeniably strong in the Force, his origins remained a mystery and the source of his power mystified. All rumor had it he'd once crushed a Republic cruiser hanging in orbit above his planet with his will alone, thus sparking the fear of another galactic war. If this were true, if this sinister Sith could truly reduce a Republic cruiser to scrap metal with an errant thought, then he might be strong enough to face Master Yoda himself. As such, the Dark Lord's abrupt arrival was not taken very lightly. Several counselors reached for their lightsabers purely on instinct before they realized their folly. Were it not for the blue-tinged appearance of the hologram, they would have attempted to strike him down outright. As it was, there was nothing for them to strike but empty air. Karr held their attention in silence, saffron orb sweeping over each master in turn, his form emanating from a single circular disc in the center of the room, likely left behind by one cleaning droid. How on earth he'd managed to accomplish such a feat without leaving the planet only bespoke of his contacts. If this man could somehow smuggle a miniature hall projector into the temple, what else could he do? Darth Karr had discarded his Mandalorian escape armor, favoring instead the dark loose cloak and boots most Sith seemed to favor. Golden eyes blazed out at them from within the shadows of his cowl, his grin a brilliant streak of white set against the black of his hood. I see my presence has caused quite a stir, he noted aloud. Gloved fingers peeled back the hem of his hood, exposing his chiseled face in full view of the Jedi Council. If he reveled in their looks of surprise and shock, he did little to show it. Rather, he maintained his silence, waiting for the Jedi delegation to do the same. Are you quite done pissing your pants like a Keldor? He drawled. Because if so, I'd like to wish you all a happy holidays. Plo Koon inclined his head in accordance. The Keldor maintained his silence, however, in the wake of the Sith Lord's unkindly insult to his race. Called just to tell us all this, have you? Yoda asked. Not quite. Carr grinned. Although, if you think I'll be getting coal again this year, you've got another thing coming. See, I decided to hell with the jolly old man if he won't give me what I want. Well, I'll just take it. Speaking of taking, I see that a certain Zabrak is in attendance today. Is that you over there, Master Kohler? Aiden Kohler absently touched a hand to his horned head, favoring one of the stumps left behind by the recently crowned Dark Lord. The Zabrakian disliked dealing in politics as it was. He'd much rather finish off this troublesome whelp and be done with the dishonor he'd suffered in battle. The boy had caught him off guard last time, that was all. How was he to know that the terrifying Sith could transform into such an exasperating form? It could be worse, Kit Fisto snickered. Kohler shot Kit a withering look for a moment, a look which the latter didn't even seem to shrug off. How could this possibly be any worse? Blunt as ever, he saw no point in dancing around this topic, especially if it saved him a reaming from Master Yoda. Where is Shaak Ti? Her beacon informed us she touched down on your world, but she has yet to leave. Quite right. Carr permitted himself a small smile. She did land on my planet, but she is unavailable at the moment. The words, though genteel, set off a chain of events that even the Dark Lord himself, with his powers of foresight, could not have predicted, nor this vision his words would produce and inflict upon the venerable masters of the Order. The Jedi Council erupted into chaos. Master Windu flinched as though he'd been struck, his visage contorting in a rictus of pained confusion, as the Force revealed to them the provocation of Darth Brood, coupled by Shaak Ti's incapacitation, and her Padawan's valiant battle and subsequent fall from the light at the hands of the Sith. Not again. In the same instant Ki-Adi-Mundi lurched to his feet, the accomplished warrior, nearly stumbling into a stunned Kit Fisto. An irate Aiden Kohler had the wherewithal to keep his seat, although he too spat a curse in his native tongue. Carr briefly allowed himself to revel in the chaos he'd inadvertently caused. It was petty things like this, the pained reactions of old men, too set in their ways, that reminded him of his true place in the grand scheme of things. This was what happened when they sought to control the young, to hold sway over them, and their EV action to dictate their very way of life. Rebellion. Amidst the chaos, only Master Yoda stood strong, the closing of his heavy lids the only indication that the diminutive Jedi had felt any sorrow at all for the fall of Shaak Ti's Padawan. Carr begrudgingly acknowledged that it would take much more than an errant Force vision to rattle the Grand Master. Regrettable, her actions are. He breathed. But falter, we cannot. As if by a calming wind, his words restored order to this chaos, breathing peace and serenity back into the room. Master Windu was amongst first of the masters to recover, his dark features settling back into the mask of apathy for which he was so well known. A muscle jumped in his jaw, the only indicate of his anger. Ki-Adi-Mundi composed himself with supreme effort, returning to his seat alongside Kit Fisto. Both looked abashed. Carr was the sole silent party in the room, his smile not quite reaching those eerie golden eyes. Why tell us this? Mace Windu demanded. The Sith simply sighed. Secrets are dangerous. He quoted, his words soft, bordering upon the precipice of nostalgia. Secrets are difficult. Secrets can kill. Beg your pardon? Just an old quote from my master. The Darth returned. I thought it best to be honest, rather than beat around the bush as you Jedi are wont to do. So yes, I have them. Both of them. I will not harm them further unless given adequate cause. So by all means, send another strike team. I'll have their gift-wrapped bodies back to you by Christmas Eve. What do you plan to do with them? Ki-Adi-Mundi demanded, the mountain of his forehead creasing as he struggled to feel the calm once more, to contemplate the true intention of the Sith. They could not allow a master to fall to the dark side, they simply could not. It would be a blow to the Order. As if sensing his intent, Carr chortled softly, golden eyes dancing with glee. Do The Sith Lord scoffed. I shall do nothing with them, Jedi. If Shaak Ti and Darth Brood wish to accept my humble offer of hospitality for the holidays, then who am I to refuse them? The serene Jedi scowled, but did not press matters further. Christmas be damned, but this Sith was annoying. Kit Fisto, not Olin though he was frowned. His thoughts were with the two Jedi, but ultimately, his heart was with another, one of far greater importance to him. And Mela. Here, the Dark Lord did frown. Though he stood leagues distant from them, they could feel his anger, sense his ire stretching across the galaxy itself. Had he been standing before them in the flesh, a confrontation would have ensued. As it were, he gave a here-stopping hiss, stunning them into silence. She is no longer any concern of yours, Jedi. His words dripped with derision. I have been tolerant of your inquiries thus far, but believe me when I say I shall tolerate them no longer. Mela has made her decision. And if you do not believe me, well, I shall be more direct then. He made way for another minus. And Mela Sakura stepped in. Mela. Good to see you it is. Yoda inclined his head. And you as well, Grand Master. Mela managed a wan smile. Kit, you're looking well. I wish I could say the same of you, little one. Those who have power should restrain themselves from using it. The Twi'lek said softly. Weren't those your words, Kit? A silent pallor descended over the council. Car isn't using his power the way you think he is. He's not the Sith you think he is. He's just a man. A good man, flawed, just like the rest of us. Her voice fell, dropping to the softest of sighs, the weakest of whispers. Perhaps more than you'll ever know. Mela, please, think about what you're doing. Mace argued. You're being seduced by the dark side. I'm sorry, masters, but I'm happy here. The smallest of smiles wreathed the woman's pale lips. I know you think I've turned away from the light, but I haven't. She turned toward her Sith master and accepted his hand, fingers fitting flawlessly within his own cerulean skin, mingling with the Dark Lord's fierce features. I'm at peace. For the first time in the longest time, I truly am. She stepped away, but not before giving the Sith Lord a chaste kiss upon the lips. Car pulled her closer, and the Twi'lek folded into the kiss, her leku curling with pleasure. Reluctantly he released her and allowed her to retreat beyond the hollow eyes, but gleaming with satisfaction. Satisfied? Hardly. Mace frowned. Hardly? Now it was Car's turn to scoff, his saffron eyes narrowing into sibilant slits. You speak as if you are above me, my dear Jedi. And yet ye kill the innocent. Betray your friends. Destroy the very ones to whom you claim allegiance. Animals you are, the lot of you. You seek to pin the mantle of murderer upon me when your hands are thrice stained with countless lives yourselves. Clan killers. He all but spat the word, golden eyes inflamed with anger. Send another ambassador, and I might consider sparing you, and your Griffin ilk live to see the next Christmas. Car out. A soft click terminated the transmission. There was a silence. Shaak Ti and Ikataki, Jedi Master more accustomed to the field of battle than peace, bit back a smile of his own. Darth or not, that was quite the stick the lad had used to tell them to bugger off with. Such a shame he was a Sith. He would have made one hell of a Jedi. Well, that went better than expected. Plo Koon mused. How so? Mace couldn't quite keep the strain from his words. They'd only succeeded in riling the man. And yet Plo Koon was not nearly as distressed as they'd thought him to be. The Keldor shifted comfortably in his seat beneath the weight of their combined gaze, folded both hands in his lap, turning goggled eyes to address his fellow Jedi. We already know he possesses the technology to leave the planet at will, correct? And yet he does not. He paused for the effect, a second of silence passing between his fellow masters as they absorbed this knowledge. His fleet stands at several thousand heavily armed dreadnoughts with at least a dozen lesser craft and fighter squadrons, and it grows by the day. More than we can hope to bring to bear at the moment. In standing his ground and calling for continued talks, he shows that despite the animosity we have garnered to him, He is still willing to seek a peaceful solution in light of the holidays. Does that make him a Sith, I wonder? He makes a powerful point. Tin argued. He has not attempted to leave his home system. Problematic this is. Grand Master Yoda frowned. Taken action must be. There was a silence. Everyone knew of Kar's crimes, and yet the Supreme Chancellor refused to authorize a fourth and final SD arc against them after watching his fleet be obliterated in orbit by that planetary defense cannon. And thus, Kar's reign would continue to flourish unchecked. What's more, he'd managed to seduce an alarming number of Jedi away from the Order and to his cause, turning powerful knights and promising Padawans to the dark side with an ease as effortless as it was disturbing. And yet, in spite of this, Kar would send the first strike team back in pieces within a standard galactic week. The second team mysteriously vanished before setting foot on the planet, and the third suffered the same fate as the first. All save one. His first victim had been Padawan Barriss Offee, student to Luminara Unduli. With the sole exception of the Mirielon Padawan and her master, all others were shipped back to the Council in body bags, lacking their lightsabers. Master Unduli would soon prove to be the sole survivor, or so they thought at the time of that terrible massacre. Her mind, stripped of all knowledge of the incident by an unknown means. It was as if Kar had broken something within her, made her unable to remember. Shaak Ti had volunteered to spearhead negotiations with the Sith herself so as to secure the safe release of Padawan Barriss Offee and Knight Nayla Sakura amongst others. And now Shaak Ti was missing, nearly a month having passed since her last transmission. "I will go," Mace began, but a three-fingered hand silenced him. "Go this planet, I must," Yoda announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Speak with this Sith Lord, I will ascertain his intentions." All heads turned toward the Grand Master, unable to believe what it was they were hearing. "Already high tensions are with the Separatists," the diminutive master pointed out. "Risk war breaking out we cannot. After all, likely it is that the Sith we seek, he is not." "But Master Yoda minus. Secret shall I tell you?" The ancient Jedi smiled. "Grand Master of Jedi Order, I won this job in a raffle, I did. Thank you." "How did you know? How did you know, Master Yoda?" "Master Yoda knows these things. His job it is. But he may attempt to turn you as well." Yoda smiled. "Not if anything to say about it I have." "Aren't we being a bit overcautious here?" Kit piped up abruptly, rising from his seat. The earlier emotion that had wreathed his pale features was gone, replaced by an icy, steely calm. "Grand Master, while I've no doubt of your ability, shouldn't you consider an alternative suggestion?" Yoda blinked, his wrinkled face pinched in confusion. "More to say have you, Master Fisto?" "I do." "Then hear you, we will." "Why not send Kenobi?" the Natulan suggested. "While not nearly as gifted as Shaak Ti, if it's negotiation we want, I'm more than certain he's up to the task." "Possible this is," Yoda said. "Just returned from Anshan, they have." "Believe this, do you?" "Without a doubt." Several of the remaining counselors inclined their heads in acknowledgement. "Agreed we are then," Yoda declared, the smallest of frowns touching his face. "Send Master Kenobi and his Padawan to the planet, we will. Inform the Senate of this development." "We will not." Another silence passed, heavier than the last. This was a bold move they were making. A dangerous move. Should Palpatine learn, should the Republic learn of this action, there would be repercussions. Mace steepled his fingers and bowed his head. Somehow, he did not share in the other's confidence. He'd seen the passion in those cold yellow eyes, the willingness to cut down an enemy, no matter whom they might be. He feared that with this vote, they just condemned Kenobi and Skywalker to death. Or worse. May the Force be with us all. In other parts of the galaxy, other plans were being made to deal with this renegade Sith Lord. Plans that had nothing to do with peace, but rather war. Plans that had been in motion for many years and only now come to fruition. Count Dooku stood before a holoprojector, confronting the cowled face of his lord and master Darth Sidious. "What is they bidding my master? How goes the operation?" The Darth Lord hissed. Have you made the preparations? We will be ready in a matter of months. Tyrannus bowed. Which gives us more than enough time to dispense with our so-called Sith Lord on Ninjato. I promise, I will not fail you a second time minus. There will be no next time, Lord Tyrannus. Sidious rasped out, cutting the count off. What? Dooku could scarcely believe his ears. The boy was a threat to everything they stood for. To their grand plan for war and the ascension of the Sith. How could they leave him be? Master. I'm afraid I do not understand. Lord Carr and I have a pre-existing arrangement. Sidious's smile was so slight most beings, most Jedi might they missed it, but not the Count. He was not most Jedi. He has promised not to interfere in our plans so long as he and his planet are left untouched. A muscle jumped in Dooku's jaw, but he carefully controlled it as his master continued. Listen well, Tyrannus. I will not tolerate any insubordination in this matter. You are to leave the boy alone. There was a silence. It shall be done, my master. See that it is, Lord Tyrannus. Darth Sidious barked out, his form fading seconds thereafter, leaving the Count in silence. The mood was tense, thick enough to be slit with a knife. All his calm, every ounce of his control had been stripped away. Tyrannus glowered at the wall. This was one order he had no intention of obeying. Carr had already made a fool of him back on Kamino, already wrested his best assassin away from him before the war could even begin, and he was supposed to leave him be? To let him flourish, with the small army he'd already created? No, Dooku would not do this. But he himself would not be leaving the planet, rather, his most recent acquisition would do the deed. Will you do this? Dooku directed the question at a pale woman, her crimson hair tied back in a top knot. Her name was one that sent chills down every spine, especially those of the Jedi. A chance to kill this many Jedi, and a Sith Lord? Aurra Singh smiled, all pearly whites and all venom. I'd take the job even if you weren't paying me. Her laughter was like the peal of 100 bells. Dooku liked to think they extolled the end of Carr and his little harem. And yet, their heavenly chorus was soured by Singh's assumption. But to associate this whelp with the Sith? Never. The boy was playing with forces beyond his control, and he would soon pay the price for it. That was all. It mattered not that he'd stolen away his best assassin in Ventress, nor that he refused any and all attempts for a rematch. It was simply a matter of pride. Dooku could not beget this, could not allow this boy to ruin a plan centuries in the making. So this Sith kid. You want him dead, or alive? Aurra asked, her words dragging the Count from his reverie. Dooku bristled a bit at the misassociation. The boy was not Sith. He is not Sith. He cautioned, advising the Huntress. All the same, you must be cautious. His voice is his greatest weapon of all. He will try to sway you to his side, as he has others. Sure, whatever you say. Singh waved his words away with the flick of a wrist. Let's see him try and talk his way out of my sights. I have every confidence in you. Dooku feigned a smile. Carr throws a gala every year around this time celebrating this old Christmas tradition of his. You will infiltrate his fortress disguised as a guest. And when he is alone. Singh raised her hands as if to ward off the words. Hey, no need to tell me twice. The Huntress made a crossing motion across her neck. He'll be dead as a doorknob before Christmas Eve. Still further away. Darth Sidious, also known as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, could scarcely contain his amusement as he sank back into his pleated chair and looked out across the Coruscanti skyline. He knew full well that his apprentice would not leave Carr alone. Tyrannus would doubtlessly attempt some elaborate scheme to eradicate the Sith without his master's knowing. Unfortunate, but expected, because Sidious knew all. He'd worked very hard to cultivate this particular asset. From the moment the boy first laid hands upon the holocron, he knew him. As his powers grew and spanned the cosmos, as countless beings sensed his power and were drawn to him, so too did Darth Sidious find himself drawn to the boy. At first he'd thought to kill him, but no, the Force had a plan for him, a plan which, he knew, lay deeply intertwined with the dark side. Discovering that Force-talented woman with him, Now that had been a stroke of luck. So long as the boy cared for others, he had a lever to use against him. Sidious did. If he ever dreamed heavens forbid of conquering the cosmos, he had only to try and take a planet, then Sidious would reveal his trump card. It was only a matter of time. Barriss Offee wasn't at all surprised by her words of her lord. It had only been a matter of time before Carr reached out with the Force to investigate what was going on, and now that he had, well, it had come to this. Darth Carr, her master, husband, and Dark Lord of the Sith, loomed over her like a thundercloud, saffron eyes searing into her sapphire with eerie intent. The Mirielon woman shivered, her mouth open in a small round oval, unable to complete the sentence, to finish the words that threatened to leave her lips. The blonde Sith leaned over her, the flames of desire of anger sparkling in his eyes. They were strange eyes. Very strange for a Sith. Barriss had been frightened of them. In the beginning she hadn't liked meeting his gaze. But that had been a long time ago. A very long time ago. And now, she found herself frightened of them once more. You lied to me, Barriss. The former Jedi squirmed beneath his gaze, his words cutting to the bone. There was nowhere for her to run and nowhere for her to hide, his arms trapping her body against the bathroom wall, the white towel she wore the only thing standing between her and outright nakedness. The Dread Lord had come barreling into her room mere minutes before, scarcely giving her the time to dress herself before a Force-augmented shove tore the Durasteel door from its hinges. His usage of his unique Force talent, Shatterpoint, genuinely frightened her at times. Now it had her terrified. She did not know whether she was staring at the genuine article or a clone, but she knew now the fury in his eyes and recognized it as real. Now Barriss tried a smile and instantly regretted it. Her husband was in no mood. They'd been married all of 2 years, thus a tumultuous time of ups and downs, highs and lows. Conversely, the former knight found herself wondering which this was, and what it might be that had roused her bondmate's wrath. Whatever do you mean? A low growl silenced her. Do not lie to me, Barriss. His words were deadly soft, silken and sinister in their intent. Do not lie to me. If there was one thing which he loathed above all else, it was lies. Though they may not have been subject to the unscrupulous desire to share him with the others, she only betted him when they were alone. She nonetheless found herself reminded of a krayt dragon. She knew he adhered to a different axiom than most Sith, and that he'd never harm her, but even so, she couldn't complete the thought that he might actually hurt her if she did not give him the answer he sought. You're pregnant. It was not a question, but rather, a statement. Barriss nodded, the sudden motion causing her raven tresses still damp from the shower to bob slightly. She'd meant to tell him, she really had. A month ago. Now, there could be no mistaking it. The swelling of her stomach had grown increasingly prominent of late, difficult to try and mask during the course of her pregnancy to begin with, and now, 2 months she had become increasingly reclusive, desperate to conceal the awful truth for as long as possible. His fingers roamed across her olive skin, sending the sweetest shivers shooting down her spine. At any other time she would have gladly welcomed his touch. Now, she fidgeted. She let out a small peep of fear. You're not angry. Of course, I am. Carr snarled, but his words were empty without rancor. You lied to me, Barriss. You know how I hate it when you do that. He turned his back on her, briefly regarding the destruction he'd wrought. You should have told me this sooner. I might have been able to do something minus. There came the unmistakable sound of a lightsaber being ignited, and Carr looked over just in time to see possibly the most murderous glare he had ever seen on her features. And this came from a Sith Lord. Carr actually found it rather sexy, in a feral sort of way. Her hand moved with acute swiftness, and it was only a last-minute nudge from the Force that sent the saber flying out of her grasp and skittering across the floor. Oh, force me, he muttered, seeing her thunderous expression. I didn't mean it like that, and you know it. As much as Carr might have despised the very concept of calm, he admitted it had its uses when it came to soothing the soul of a young woman such as Barriss. When it came to her, he couldn't just run about wreaking havoc whenever he felt like it. Oh no, she wouldn't like that at all. She certainly didn't like it now. You have 5 seconds to explain what the curfew meant, the former Padawan hissed in return, and for a moment, a mere moment, the smallest sliver in time, Carr watched those expressive blue eyes become stained with gold. Briefly, he balked a bit. He no longer experienced the concept called fear, but it was in times such as these he was reminded of it all the same and it galled him. Women were truly terrifying sometimes. Especially when they were pregnant. Carr snarled at her. Boris bared her teeth right back. 5. Stang. He spat at the floor. Just give me a second minus. 4. Boris, this isn't funny minus. 3. I'm warning you minus. 2. Cut it out minus. 1. Enough. Naruto bellowed, throwing the full weight of the force behind his words. I am Darth Carr, and you will treat me as such, you troublesome woman. He glared bloody red daggers at Boris, daring her to continue. When she did not, Naruto drew a deep breath of his own. I meant, I would have liked to know whether, or not, I was going to be a father. He swore beneath his breath, cursing himself for not sensing her pregnancy earlier. He reached out to her now, touching the life in her womb with the force, and recoiled in disbelief. When the force came for him this time, the images were far too swift for him to read. Countless futures swam in and out of focus for him: life, death, peace, sorrow, and yet in each, there was a single content. Twins. Barriss was pregnant with twins. Boris must have sensed his efforts, because her expression, though still dark, became less thunderous. She ceased her so-called doomsday countdown, her features softening. Truly Ufef. He made no move to resist when she shoved him backwards, toppling him out of the bathroom, sending him sprawling upon the bedroom floor. He sat up, propping himself on his elbows. When he looked up, Offie slapped him on the back of the head, with enough force for him to feel it. You are the worst man in the universe. She sat on his lap, and when he looked up, her face hung a mere millimeters from his own. Their noses were touching as her furious expression gave way to a loving tender look, her features softening so suddenly, so swiftly, that the Dark Lord was a bit taken aback. But you're my man. She darted forward, mouth sealing over his in a chaste kiss before he knew what hit him. It was over in an instant, and the Sith found himself hungering for her as Barriss leaned into him, feeling an arm fall onto her hip, holding her in place as Carr placed a soft kiss against the nape of her neck. His fingers unwound the towel from her waist and cast it aside, hurling the damp garment to the floor, his fingers seeking out the subtle bulge of her stomach. I suppose I can live with that, he murmured into her. She shivered against him, her fingers plucking at his cloak and his armor and then his chest, peeling aside each article of clothing to reveal the man beneath the armor. She gasped as this man, this Sith, lifted her from the floor and carried her to the bed, careful, very careful so as not to harm her. Her back greeted the sheets and then the headboard as she strove with fumbling fingers to unbuckle the clasp securing his pants, his mouth making the task all the more difficult as it suckled at the sweet spot on her neck. By the force. Desire like an open flame roared through her and scoured her clean when she felt it, the bulge pressing into her clit, through the fabric of his slacks. Tell me you want me, Boris. He whispered in her ear, his mouth nibbling at her ear, his hand seeking her bosom. Tell me you need me. I want you. She gasped out, squirming beneath him as her hands grappled with his belt. I need you. A furious flick of her hand with the force sent the belt tumbling away, pants and all, leaving her husband to join her in her nakedness. She spread her legs for him, restlessly awaiting him as his erect member touched the sensitive folds of her swollen sex. And then he was in her, within her, each thrusting sending a savage spike of agony down her spine. She locked her legs with him and against his waist, forced him deeper. Harder. This was why she refused to share him with the others. Boris was too selfish, too greedy to allow him to be in bed with anyone but her at any one time. Oh, she knew of his other apprentices, but she would only ever allow him to take her when they were alone. Today, on the eve of Christmas Eve, was no exception. She wouldn't be able to do such things months from now as time passed, as she became heavier and heavier with child. With children. Varys had seen Darth Kar's expression when he reached out to her in the Force, and then she had seen his delight at the knowledge. His love for her. It was in times such as these that she wondered why she hadn't left the Order sooner. She'd missed out on so much, the life all sentients were entitled to, a life she herself had been denied. Life. Love. Happiness. Everything she'd ever shunned within those hallowed halls was now hers. She had friends here. Family. And a lover that could satisfy her every whim and need, and oh dear Lord. Varys flushed as she felt her orgasm coming on again, and was helpless to do so much as slow it. She always came so quickly under his touch, was always helpless to prevent it. And yet still, she fought on, mouth wrestling against him, tongue tangling against him as he touched and stroked and thrust in. Cammy. Oh, my lord. This time, Varys Ophi could not resist as she came. As the warmth of his seed filled her, capturing her with delight. She gave a small moan of contentment and collapsed against him, her green skin slicked with seep. She gasped out one final time and delivered a chaste kiss to his lips before sinking back down to his chest. Naruto. Though he was already falling into slumber, he stirred against her, regarding her through lidded slits. Despite herself, the former Padawan felt her skin tingle with renewed passion. She wanted him again. She wanted him so badly it hurt, and it made her feel safe, loved, and warm. She managed to ask a single question before she slipped into slumber. "You'll love our children, won't you?" She snuggled closer against him, smiling as he stroked at her dark hair. Of course. There could be no mistaking the fervor in his words when he spoke. Varys felt him through the Force, and knew what he had said to be true. She could see them now. Her family. Sith, though he might be, she knew he wouldn't dare harm their offspring, just as he'd never harm her. And should anything ever happen to her, he would raise them, teach them all that he knew. She could see it now, in her future. Happiness. And thus, she contented herself to sleep. Elsewhere. Shaak Ti woke with a start, her body screaming, her mind adrift amidst a sea of pain. She tried to center herself in the light of the Force. To embrace the agony and the anger and push them aside as she was often wont to do, but the searing lance of agony wedged within her gut made her think twice. She felt a sudden and swift spike of delight somewhere in the upper levels, a presence in the Force she vaguely recalled, though nowhere near as fierce as it felt now. She felt a wave rolling over her, emanating in the afterglow of a feeling she herself had never experienced in her lifetime. Love. Like a gentle breeze wafting across her face, the softest whisper in her ear, she felt it. Heard it. The Force spoke to Shaak Ti, telling her of what had transpired, revealing a Arillion in a blissful slumber, her head tucked into the chest of her lover beside, her body spooned against him. Varys. She was here. In the compound. Shaak Ti struggled to sit up, but another spike of pain sending her sprawling back down. It was the restraints, she realized. Electroshock cuffs. And with the shock, came memory. She remembered pain, lightning jolting across the expanse between her and the Sith Lord, striking her before she could hope to draw her saber. Agony, licking across her flesh, sending her body into spasms. She hadn't been fast enough. Too slow. He had beaten her, disarmed her with ease. Shaak Ti felt naked without her lightsaber. But she was a Jedi Master, and she had other tools to avail herself of. With a brief mental effort, she forced the pain to the back of her mind and embraced clarity. She stretched her senses out, searching for a way through the fog clouding her senses for anything at all. There. Maris. Through the haze of the dark side she felt her Padawan, sensed her in the Force. Maris was alive. Beyond that she knew little, yet she dared not reach out to her, lest Kar sense her movements. Ah, and so the sleeping beauty stirs. Oh, force me. Shaak Ti let the curse slip as the doors whooshed open, revealing the very same Sith, flanked by two guards, beings she had not seen at the landing pad. They vaguely reminded her of Mandalorians, and yet, their garb was off. Lacking in armor of any sort, each wielded what looked like a staff. Despite these warriors' trappings, it was immediately obvious to Shaak Ti that they posed no threat. The Force was barely alive in them. The power that burned so brightly inside Kar was nothing but a dying ember of gray ash in these two. Master though she was, she couldn't help but pity the pair. These two had been discovered and trained at a late age, too late to unlock their true potential. There was nothing she could do for them. One of them was male, the other, intimately female. That much was painfully obvious even with her form obscured by the fold the cloak. She clung to Kar like a second skin, her body seeming to meld with the darkness itself, merging with the shadows whenever Shaak Ti looked away. Nay, the Jedi Master was forced to focus upon the woman, wondering all the while what was blunting her perception in the Force. She didn't need the Force to sense their resolve, however. This pair remained utterly dedicated to Kar, willing to give their lives for their lord at a moment's notice. Shaak Ti was momentarily taken aback by it. She did not expect such loyalty from what she assumed to be hired hands. "Leave us," Kar commanded, and the pair vanished without a word. Rather, one of them did. The second lingered, her helmet turned toward Shaak Ti, then back to him. She seemed to fidget for the briefest of instants, clearly contemplating whether or not she should leave her lord alone with this woman. And in that instant, her defenses lowered. Shaak Ti realized she'd been brutally deceived, because the woman was masking her presence in the Force. Though she clearly stood there, concerned and contrite, she let her barrier slip, and what had been a dying ember became a roaring flame. Belatedly, Shaak Ti realized this woman's level of skill was near that of a knight's, or perhaps even a low-level master. Just who was this Darth Kar to surround himself with such loyal individuals? "Eno," Kar sighed, sensing her intent. "I will be fine." The guardswoman stiffened. She laid a single cage down at his feet, the like of which contained a large lizard, clinging to an equally large branch. In her stunned state, Shaak Ti found herself curious as to just what this creature's was, but ultimately Kar's conversation with his chief lieutenant distracted her senses. "I'll be down the hall, should you need me." Kar's face creased in a small smile. "And I'll be right here, dear." The woman made a small sound that could have been embarrassment or exasperation, or possibly even both. She slapped both hands against a nearby panel and the door whooshed shut, separating them. Shaak Ti waited until she was certain they were alone. Only then did she dare to look the Sith Lord dead in the eye. Kar may have caught her unawares the first time, but he would so easily do that a second time. "I suppose you intend to torture me now, Sith?" She knew he would try to break her, knew he wanted to turn her, but she'd not give him the satisfaction. She was a Jedi Master. She would stay strong. She would not break. She would not falter even if it meant certain death. "Torture you?" The Dark Lord blinked, his clear eyes wide with surprise. "Do you truly think so little of me, Master Jedi?" He gestured with a hand, and Shaak Ti subsequently balked as her restraints flew open as one, leaving her utterly unbound. The Dark Lord offered Shaak Ti a hand, the Togrutan carefully ignored it whilst she rose. There was not so much as a single lightsaber at his belt, not that it mattered. She was too baffled to even consider fleeing, her dumbfounded mind refusing to even contemplate the matter of her escape. She was vaguely aware of Kar, and a strange numbness began to envelop her the longer she looked at him. Was he hiding his presence in the Force? No. But then what was going on? What was happening? "You. What? Why?" She managed to sputter. Her head was still swimming. Had she been drugged? She tried to reach out for the Force, but felt only emptiness. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. She struggled to stand, to rise, to do anything at all, but her body betrayed her, her legs giving out the moment her feet touched the floor. "Oh!" Strong's arms encircled her, and Shaak Ti hadn't the strength to fight them. She collapsed into him, her fists clutching at the lapels of his jacket. She reached out for the Force once more and found only emptiness. She could not touch the powerful nexus of life energy she'd known all her life. It was simply and abruptly gone. Her control, slipping through her fingers like so much water when she tried to grasp at it. "What have you done to me?" she gasped out, feeling as though she'd just lost a limb. "What have you done?" He finished for her. I have done nothing. Tell me, Shaak Ti, do you know of the Ysalamiri? Of course you do. It holds the most marvelous ability to the most fascinating thing to prevent anyone within its radius from exerting any influence over the Force whatsoever. Of course, I am also without the ability to use the Force at present, but I have other talents and am not so reliant upon either as to make them my crutch as you have. Shaak Ti fumbled against him, tried to strike him. He caught her wrist as effortlessly as one would a petulant child, his fingers tight against her slim arm. She felt weak, disoriented. You are no captive. Carr admonished her attempt. So long as you swear not to speak of what transpires within these walls, you are free to come and go as you please. He released her abruptly, the doors sliding open to reveal the armed guard from before. She saluted smartly and reached down for the lizard, plucking both lizard and harness from the earth, as though they weighed not but a feather. Her faceplate stared out at her, cold, emotionless, betraying nothing. Without a word, she did the inexplicable, taking Shaak Ti by the arm and lead her down an opposite passage. This way, if you would, Master Jedi. I have a party to attend. The Dark Lord chortled softly. It simply wouldn't do for one of my guests to discover a Jedi of your caliber locked in the basement, now would it? Now come, let's get you dressed. Shaak Ti blanched as she found herself led off by the Ysalamir-bearing woman towards an adjacent room. What? Carr's laughter, or rather, the laughter of his cage bunchin, could be heard down the hall. Why, for the party, of course. Carr chortled. You and your Padawan are to be guests of honor. But before you prepare for the festivities, I should tell you something about Barriss Offee, since your Padawan seemed so concerned about her the other day. And that would be. She's a screamer. Carr stated with much mirth before turning on his heel and striding down the corridor, leaving a fuming Shaak Ti in his wake. The Jedi Master flushed, desperately trying to ward off the perverted images of Barriss in the throes of passion from invading her brain. So that was what she'd felt earlier. By the Force. What had she gotten herself into? Chapter 5, Temptation. She's devoted, boy, not evil. Just like you. Kyubi. Temptation. By the Force. What had she gotten herself into? These were the thoughts of Darth Brood, echoing that of her master. She too was alone, but not as she'd expected to be. She was alone, yet surrounded. At first she thought the guards would truss her up and throw her in a cell the moment she'd been healed, leave her there to rot. They hadn't, quite the opposite actually. Once Carr's medical staff had reattached her arm, she found herself all but ushered to one of the upper floors by a number of slaves, their races broad as the galaxy itself. From Togrutan to Twi'lek, not so much as a Zabrak amongst them, she noted they hustled the reeling Padawan up a flight of stairs, through a turbolift and finally to a solid-looking door flanked by a pair of masked yet still equally solid-looking Kalash bodyguards. Wrapped in thick, black-plated armor, the aliens stood erect and at attention, their golden eyes following her as she neared the doorway. Despite herself and all her training, the Padawan felt a tendril of terror worm its way into her gut. So Carr had enlisted the aid of the infamous warrior race after all. Their appearance belied their ferocity. Morris couldn't help but blanch at the sight of them. Kalash were well known for their warlike nature, they made for excellent shock troopers. She sensed that these two were no exception. One was emphatically female even beneath the contour of her attire, the other distinctly male. Each bristled visibly at the sight of Morris, their hands drifting to the vibroblades laced with cortices most likely sheathed at their belts. She knew they would use them against her, against a Jedi, without hesitation. Their hatred of the Jedi for failing to repulse the Huk from their homeworld for protecting them when they, the Kalash, sought vengeance, was well known. And no, they saw her. Another Jedi for Lord Carr. One of the Kalash, the male rumbled deep into his mask, his golden slitted eyes training mercilessly upon Morris. It is a shame, little one. I would have very much liked to add your lightsaber to my collection. Alas, it seems that is not to be. For now. He chortled softly to himself as he brushed a hand against his belt, and then only then did Darth Brood recognize the odd hilts at his waist. Lightsabers. The Kalash had the weapons of a Jedi. Many Jedi. She recalled the number, the sabers of the first strike team sent to stop Car. Maris felt a pit open in her stomach. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was as if the force itself had given way, leaving her standing above the precipice, hanging between life and death. When she finally found the words, they were thick with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. Sorrow. Where? Where did you get those? The Kalash laughed. It was a deep, throaty sound. He leaned forward, his eyes black pits behind the mask. His breath, warm and fetid, washed over her, leaving the Padawan more nauseated than she'd ever felt before. And that was before he spoke. Lord Car is most generous in his instruction, studying at his feet, even one as unworthy as I can learn to kill you and your kind Jedi. The pit in Brood's gut warped into a black hole, threatening to drag her in and obliterate her mind altogether. Even with the force she knew his words rang true, painfully so. This Kalash. This monster had killed her comrades, and he'd done it with gleeful malice in his heart. A non-force user, kill a Jedi? Absurd? Ridiculous. Once she would have scoffed at such a thing and dismissed his claim out of hand, but now. She was beginning to have second thoughts. 9 hilts hung at his waist. One for each of the Jedi he must have slain. Barisafi's blade was strangely and conspicuously absent, however, though the thought did precious little to ease the shattered state of her mind. With a soft hiss, the Zabrakian stepped backwards, wrapping the force around herself like a shield, as though she could somehow ward off the piercing glares directed at her. She could not retreat, not with the servants at her back, nor could she hope to smash through the stoic Kalash barring her path. Her frustration flared, fanning the flames of her fury. Had they brought her here to be killed then? Was this all a trick to lull her into a false sense of security? Well, she wouldn't go quietly. She would fight. To her last breath, she would minus. Enough of this. The words tore through her defenses like the claws of an angry rancor, shattering her resolve. Maris half expected to find the Lord of the Sith standing at her shoulder. Imagine her surprise when she found it was the as of yet silent Kalash woman who had spoken. Grievous. The female Kalash beside him spoke softly, but when she did her words carried the weight and authority of her station. She has not yet proven herself. Do not provoke her. For the longest moment there was silence. Then the arrogant male did something that surprised Maris. He bowed. Those cruel eyes seemed to soften just for an instant, and when he did next raise his head his words were not those of a subordinate to a superior, but rather one loved one to another. You are right as always, Comer my love. He cast a withering glare at Maris, eyes swelling with hatred. I forget myself once again in the presence of these Jedi dogs. Do not despair, beloved. Even behind that mask, the smile, the ardor could be felt in her words, although not a speck of it was directed at Maris. This one may yet fail her trial. If she does, then the children shall have their way with her. Grievous cackled harshly. Do you hear that, girl? Your fate is about to be decided. I suggest you tread carefully. It would be such a shame if you were to meet with an unfortunate accident. Maris could taste the rancor of those words and barely bit back her own bile. Barring her master, if she was still alive, she, a mere Padawan, was trapped. Alone, in an enemy compound surrounded by races who wished for nothing more than death and destruction for her outright. She didn't want to know what these children were, and thus, didn't ask. Muttering something about criffing Jedi, the Kalash male returned to his post. Enter, Jedi. Grievous spat the name as if it were a curse. To him it probably was, and indicated the door with a loose hand. Lord Car does not wish to be kept waiting. Silence beckoned, and in that silence, Maris contemplated her eventual escape. She felt naked without her lightsaber, true, but she had other weapons at hand. It occurred to her that she could use the Force to thrust the guards back against the bulkhead and make her escape. But where would she go? She could not feel her master in the Force, and their mission brief had failed to detail the inner workings of Car's compound. She could interrogate a servant, but would they even tell her anything? Would their minds be weak enough for her to see and manipulate? She cast her senses about and prayed she was not doomed to failure. In the end, the decision was not hers to make. The door whooshed open, revealing a young Zeltran woman in long diaphanous robes. Zeltrans were well renowned for their beauty, as well as their wild ways. It did not surprise Morris to see one here in a Sith Lord's palace. Her red skin seemed to gleam in the dim light, her blue eyes danced flames, the Force burned in her like a supernova, eclipsing any power Morris might have brought to bear. An acolyte then? So the Dark Lord was in fact training others. The thought stirred a pinprick of old dread in her stomach, evoking her master's words to her in the shuttle. The Sith are returning. They'd spoken of it en route to Ninjato, where her master had voiced her fears of the Council's heavy-handed approach to the re-emergent Sith Lord. Blade Master though she was, Shaak Ti was a fervent believer in peace and democracy. If she could talk an opponent down from a fight, then she would. She understood the Sith needed to be destroyed, just as she understood that anger and aggression were the ways of the dark side, but she'd been adamant on talking the Sith down rather than fighting. To do so recklessly would lead to the dark side. And Morris had given in. She let the hate flow through her, her desire to destroy the Sith to save Nayla overwhelming all else. Because of her actions, not only had they failed to subdue Darth Kar, but they'd been captured, and her master, her kind, gentle master, was likely being tortured for information even as she stood her gawking at this strange and beautiful woman. The mere thought of it made her want to weep. And yet with 2 words from the Zeltran, all her sorrow was swept away. Morris Brood? The Zeltran acolyte asked, practically purring her name. The Padawan shivered once more, but this time it was not fear that prickled her skin. It was something else. Something, a feeling, a sense she'd locked away for so long she scarcely even recognized it. Lust. She couldn't help but feel the faintest touch of desire burning beneath the blue eyes of the alien woman. There was an indefatigable charisma about her, though whether that stemmed from the dark side remained to be seen, and Morris felt herself drawn to her, felt herself nodding in compliance to the soft inquiry. The Zeltran smiled. This way, mistress. She beckoned, returning to the darkness of the door. Lord Kar awaits you. Morris watched her go, dithered a moment longer, uncertain as to whether she was being baited into a trap. She could sense the dark side, thick and angry and hateful beyond that door, and it frightened her. Sparing a baleful glare at the Kailash, she reluctantly stepped into the waiting blackness. It clung to her like a wet blanket, thick and heavy, smothering her, the light inside of her. Morris choked back a gasp, but pressed on after the dark-skinned sorcerer, shivering as she went. The darkness grew deeper, the air colder, and she had the vaguest sensation of walking downhill. They were progressing deeper into the compound then. Away from Master Shaak Ti. Wherever she was. And then the black pressed in around her, blinding her to all else, and she had no more time for thought. Gone. Her vision was gone. It was as if a hand had reached inside her and snuffed out what little light she had left, leaving her tumbling in the dark. She fought the panic as it rose, but to no avail. A small cry escaped her clenched teeth. When she slowed, the Zeltran took her by the hand and led her onward, guiding the befuddled Padawan through the blackness. Why can't I see? Morris cursed herself for the weakness in his words. What's happened to me? It is the will of the Master, the woman replied, that I blind you until you have reached him. You're doing this to me? Brood returned aghast. How? Why? A silken laugh resounded in her ears, like the chimes of 1,000 bells. How? I don't think I'm ready to tell you that just yet. She tugged her forward. As to the why, you'll learn soon enough. We cannot allow a Jedi, even one chosen by that of the Master, to know of this place before the initiation. Initiation. It is the rite that all apprentices must take. The Zeltran continued, her voice a guide in the dark, one that I myself have taken, that all with Force sensitivity must take. You will be tested, and, should the Master find you lacking, you may die. Should he find you worthy, however, you will live on under his service, study at his feet, and will want for nothing. Your every wish, be it anything, anything at all, will be granted. Anything. She spoke the words just so with such reverence, and just a touch of ardor, her emotion naked as an unsheathed blade. Morris couldn't help but to notice the sorrow that tinged those words. You failed, didn't you? A sharp intake of breath was her answer. When the Zeltron spoke next, her voice was a sibilant, heart-stopping hiss. You read my thoughts, Padawan. It seems the master has chosen well. Yes, I failed to become an apprentice. I am content to serve in a lesser role, however, so long as I can be of some use to the man to whom I owe my life. She led Morris on in silence, leaving the Zabrak with her treacherous thoughts. Part of her wanted to apologize, while the rest reveled in the pain she'd caused the older woman. She hadn't meant to offend, but offend she had. Time became non-existent. She lost track of everything and everything as she blindly followed the Zeltron in the dark. We are here. Brood found her hand abruptly released. And then it was over. The darkness peeled back from her vision with such suddenness that Morris staggered. She blinked, startled to find herself freed from the black, to be standing under the arch of an antechamber massive in size and scope, like of which housed large generators and equally large landing craft. It was an impromptu hangar bay of sorts, and yet, she could see others milling about towards the center of the room, a great host of individuals of various species and races, each fixated upon a single point. Of the Zeltron woman there was none to be seen, for which Brood was grateful. She didn't want her sight to be taken away again. Troublesome, someone muttered, his words drifting toward her as if from a great distance. Slowly, tentatively, she approached them, trying to blend in. Garbed as she was in the black robes Carr had provided for her, it was all but impossible. She hadn't thought much of it until this very moment. She'd been stripped of her comlink and all belongings upon her capture, and a servant had supplied her with the tight-fitting garments. She earned a few odd glances here and there, but none dared speak against her. She spied Carr in the center of the throng, surrounded by a host of men and women in military-style dress. He stood hunched over a holomap imposed by a series of scarlet triangles and emerald cubes indicated positions of various importance. Morris knew not their meaning, but she recognized the format nonetheless. She was looking at a map. Of what? She knew not. Only that it was of significant importance. Freely, Captain. The Darth was saying as she drew with earshot, though whom he was addressing, she knew not. I would hear what you have to say on this matter. Someone shifted just out of sight, and Brood blinked her surprise as she found herself face to face with one of the same guardsmen as before. Only this one's helmet was removed, revealing a remarkably young face, and black hair bound back in a ponytail. A single scar marred his cheek, the only flaw in otherwise flawless face. He brushed a hand against his armor black as night, and cradled his helmet under the length of his arm. I think you're making a mistake, holding this gala, Naruto. He said, matter-of-factly. Oh. Carr's eyes drifted upward, narrowed in thinly veiled amusement. How so? In general. The man grumbled, switching his helmet to the other hand. Security is going to be tight enough with the Tsukikage and Raikage present, but aren't you worried an assassin might sneak in? Carr merely blinked, but the black-haired man pressed on. On top of all that, we've got another delegation from the Jedi Temple coming in. What makes you so certain they won't attack you or the Kasgage during the festivities? A low murmur of dissent trickled through the circle at his words, but if Carr felt any anger, Morris realized, he was masking it well. He surprised her with a scoff, batting the captain's concerns aside with a hand. I may not speak for Gara, but I know for a fact that I can handle any tricks the Jedi throw at me. He reminded everyone. So long as they bring the secret of opening the oubliette with them, I have no intention of starting another war. Why are you so obsessed with that damned coffin anyway? The captain asked, and this time Morris felt anger. She'd been expecting it, bracing herself for it. Even so, she was nearly taken aback by the intensity of the Sith Lord's expression. Malice exuded from him in palpable waves, setting her hackles on edge as he rose from the holoprojector, eyes blazing. With slow, measured, and almost arrogant strides, he brought himself face to face with his head of security. "Are you questioning my authority, Shikamaru?" No, the man met his stare head-on, refusing to flinch in the wake of the Darth's wrath. "I promised her I'd do my best to keep you safe, and that's what I intend to do. If this oubliette represents a security threat, then I should know about it." Carr stared at his second-in-command for a long, hard moment. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant thing, that smile. He drew back, raising himself to his full towering height. Regarding each of them in turn, he uttered a single phrase. "A name. Celeste Morn." "Who?" Morris nearly asked the question itself, but another of his aides beat her to the punch. She didn't recognize this one either. "An ancient Jedi, said to have died thousands of years ago." Carr explained. "She is in fact alive and well in the basement." He raised a hand, forestalling conversation. "Alive, and yet any and all attempts to wake her have ended in failure. I could force her into a state of wakefulness, of course, but you see, she has something I need. Knowledge. Power. I'd rather have her, both her mind and her body, intact, and it is my belief that the Jedi know how to open this coffin without harming her, just as they possess the powers to wake her. When they do, for they will have no choice, but to I will reveal the next stage of our plan minus." Morris flinched as his gaze caught hers, widened a millimeter in surprise. "Leave us." He waved a hand at them, and they obeyed without question. The man known as Shikamaru seemed hesitant, but a curt nod from Carr sent him packing. Only when they were gone did he deign to speak once more. He circled around the holoprojector towards her, a predator, stalking its prey. A small, concerned smile tugged at his lips as he turned toward her, golden eyes tittering. They narrowed at her choice of attire. "Those robes suit you." Morris flushed beneath his praise. Thank you. How's your arm?" Morris flexed the fingers of her restored arm. Complete and whole as it had always been, as though it had never been severed to begin with. Only it wasn't. She could still feel the Dark Lord's blade, biting into her arm like the fangs of a wild beast, truncating it at the elbow, severing it from her body. He could have taken the entire limb, but instead, he'd chosen to make an example of her. That realization did precious little to dull the phantom pain in her appendage. Well, she managed. Flack. Flack, flack, flack. She was conversing with the very man who'd nearly killed her only a few hours ago. "Am my master?" she demanded suddenly. "Yes." Carr grinned. "Not you." Morris hissed. "Master Shaak Ti. Where is she?" "Alive and well, for now," the Darth answered, drawing closer still. "The two of you will meet again soon. However, she is no longer your master. I am. Is that not right, Grievous?" Morris risked a glance over her shoulder, suddenly terribly aware of the Kailash standing just out of earshot and across the hangar bay. How had she failed to notice their presence? Had they followed her? In the span of 2 beats the male Kailash glared balefully at her, returned his attention the door. The fiend. He was mocking her. And what of them? Morris was scrambling for an excuse as she stepped backward, her back striking the wall. "Oh, them?" Carr chortled softly at the mention of the Kailash duo standing just outside the door. "The big fellow used to go by another name, but he calls himself Grievous now. I liberated them, him and that lovely friend of his, from the Hutt. You'd be quite surprised how far loyalty extends in my infrastructure." His gaze abruptly hardened, golden orbs narrowing to deadly slits. "But your fear betrays you, Padawan. Every soul in this compound has sworn fealty to me on some level or another, and yet you think to subvert them. They will not turn against me. So put those thoughts from your mind, apprentice." Apprentice. The words burned in her mind like a brand as he pinned her to the bulkhead with his body. She tried to resist, but his grip was too strong, his mastery over the Force too great. "You will serve me, my apprentice," Carr whispered sweet nothings in her ear, "or you will never see your master again. You will serve me, or your order will burn." "But I am a gentle master, Darth Brood," he reassured. I promise never to harm you. Never to raise a hand against you. I shall teach you everything I know, and one day when I am gone, you will compete with the others for all that I am and ever was, the mantle of Dark Lord of the Sith. Will you learn under me, apprentice? Or will you reject your feelings and return to the light? I've already lost the light, she thought to herself, but daren't speak it aloud. Morris knew she'd made a deal with the devil to save her master, but never once had she thought the Dark Lord of the Sith would actually take her under his wing and train her. Part of her, the sense of self she denied for so long, burned with desire at the thought of new knowledge. With his strength, she need never be weak again. Never fail again. She would be able to protect her master. She might even be able to influence him, guide the Darth down a path that didn't lead to the destruction of the Republic. A thorn of pride pricked her and held her back. No. No, she mustn't. She mustn't give in. But if she didn't, what would happen to Master T? She loved the woman like a mother. All thought Jedi were forbidden to love. They were forbidden from so many things, and only now did she the wisdom in it. Only now, when it was too late to renounce herself, did she realize her mistake. Her brash and foolish attack on Car's personage had been her first brush with the dark side. She stood upon a knife's edge, at the precipice of a towering cliff. Now, as he took her chin in his hand, she found her footing beginning to erode. The kiss, when it finally came, was cool and gentle, his mouth caging her upper lip between his. It was her first kiss, and it was like nothing she'd ever felt before. Morris Brood whimpered, her bone and body turning to jelly, her resolve crumbling as he held her, making no move to do anything. And then her lips were moving, her body cleaving against his with an awkwardness that bespoke of an almost childlike innocence, fueled by desperation and passion. Every second he held her made her want to kiss more. She wanted to scream, to cry out and slam him back against bulkhead and run away from him, from his lips that were making her feel these things, that were doing these things to her, stoking the embers of her heart. The longer his lips held hers, the higher it roared. When he finally released her, finally raised her hands, she wasn't at all prepared for it. The first volley sent her to her knees. The lightning wasn't so much painful this time as it was surprising. She scarcely knew how to explain it. It was as if his kiss had awakened something in her, something that delighted in pain and passion and pleasure as much as she'd once loathed them. Morris, the Dark Lord thundered, I christen you in the name of the dark side, and claim you. Lightning licked across her flesh, setting her nerves on edge, leaving her unharmed. She shivered under the baptism. And then it was done. The white bolts abated, leaving her flesh singed, but not burnt. Dark, yet cleansed. Rise. Car rumbled. You are Jedi no longer. You are Sith. I name you. He paused, as though searching the Force itself for a name. His smile told her he'd found one. Darth Brood. Some levels above, Shaak Ti felt it in the Force. The woman with the damnable Isalimir had retreated, perhaps for this very purpose, and she felt it as painfully as a lightsaber in her gut. She paid no heed to the servants fussing about her, readying her for the festivities. She knew only thus, that her apprentice was no longer with the light. Oh no. Morris Brood had fallen. Chapter 6 Instruction. To be Sith is to never regret your actions. Ever. Naruto. Instruction. The scintillating snap hiss of dozens upon dozens of lightsabers igniting all at once filled the night air, swelling in a rising cacophony just outside the massive complex that served as Darth Kar's home. The hour was late and the moon high, the heavenly orb serving as the sole illumination upon the ungodly night. Darth Kar, bereft of his courtesis, armor and gauntlets, clad in black vestments and leathers, ignited his lightsaber and turned to face his opponents. He snapped off a salute to each of them in kind, casting himself in the devilish light, lending his visage a ghastly pallor. But he did not speak. Not yet. Instead, he allowed his golden gaze to glide across each of the students assembled before him. Gathered before him were hundreds upon hundreds of students, members of many races, hailing from many different walks of life. Some lacked aptitude with the dark side. They were but flickering embers compared to others, their power akin a candle's flame ready to be snuffed out at the slightest breath. and some surprised him. Whereas others were weak, some were strong. Naruto caught Layla's gaze in the crowd and held it as he read her emotions. She radiated curiosity, but also calm. In that, at least her Jedi training served her well. Naruto forcibly tore his gaze from hers, and willed his to carry on, taking his students in. The faces that greeted him were varied and not just by chosen species. To Car's force-enhanced senses, their emotions were naked as day. Some were hesitant, others anxious, and still many more surged in the force their power and strength of will searing his senses, like a brilliant supernova. Amongst these were his chosen, Layla Ventress, the newly christened Darth Brood, and even Grievous, though he lacked the ability to wield the force, each possessing a supreme sense of confidence bordering on outright arrogance. Good. He bid them all to gather here tonight, for a single solitary purpose, a purpose that would soon be revealed. Drawing a deep breath, his golden eyes glittering gleefully in the full moon's light, Car addressed his followers, starting to speak. To be Sith is to never regret your actions. He began. His words were stern, and heavy, laden with dark intent in the crisp evening air. To be Sith is to never falter, to do what must be done. To not hesitate. To show no mercy. These words were directed to his students and apprentices, each armed at the very least with a single weapon. Some wielded a lightsaber. Others, amphistaffs or vibroblets. A chosen few even favored the less than orthodox and far from traditional light whip of ancient lore. Naruto Car took each of them in turn, assessing their measure, weighing their worth, and all the while sensing the absence of one most keenly. Varus alone was not present tonight, and for good reason. With the Myrilian woman so heavily pregnant, he couldn't have her participating in this exercise without running risk of her suffering a miscarriage now, could he? Ventress wasn't near far enough to be subject to such risk, not that she would have missed this for the world, and as such even she was present tonight. Darth Car expected great things from her. He expected great things from all of them. But he digressed. He'd gathered them here for a reason. It was the night before the Grand Gala, the night before he was to launch his grand plan. A plan that would catch both the Jedi and the Sith unawares. A plan that, if successful, would both bring vengeance for everything that had happened to him since he'd first found Bane's holocron. Once he put it into motion, his agreement with Darth Sidious, though he still knew not the man's true identity, would be moot in point. The man thought he held a noose over Car's neck when in reality, he was blissfully unaware of the own slowly tightening around his throat. Let the man wage his war. They would be waiting. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow the Jedi would come, bringing with them the secret of the obulet, the key to open the coffin which housed Celeste Morn. And so tonight, on this night of nights, he had bid them all gather here, to call the weak from the strong, to imbue them with what very well might be for some of them his final lesson. Oh, there would be many more to come, but only for those who passed tonight's test. Some would die. Many would suffer. But for those who survived, only greatness awaited. To be Sith is to let your passions ignite, but you must never become a slave to them. Car instructed, leaving them rapt with attention, you must master your passions. Bend them to your will. Make them your own. Observe. He gestured with his free hand, and a dazzling bolt of Sith lightning erupted from the tips of his fingers, ripping into the ground at their feet to gouge the stone at their feet. One of the students, a human lad of perhaps 17, only just taking his first tottering steps into adolescence, trembled in fear. He inched backward. The motion was not lost on his mentor. Naruto made an angry noise between his teeth. Why do you cower, whelp? I. Scarce had the boy blinked than the Sith Lord loomed before him, golden eyes narrowed to mere pinpricks of saffron in the early light. Lightning crackled a dire warning from his fingertips, a deadly promise of pain if he answered incorrectly. In many ways the lad reminded him of himself, of when he'd first come in contact with the Force. He had been frightened, terrified, unable to understand, unwilling to comprehend the majesty of this power, and all that it was willing to offer. But tragedy had a way of molding your mind to the situation. By accident or design, Car had killed someone with this power. He'd ended a life when he hadn't meant to. He had lost control, and as such, he was forced to live with the consequences of his actions. That death had done something to him. Broken him. Shaped him. One tragedy followed the next, racing of the heels of his first mistake, then the second and a third. Before long he began to realize he was the cause of this misfortune, not the Force. The next time someone died, it had been on his blade. They'd been a friend. Trying to lead him back to the light. And he'd killed her. Ended her life in cold blood. Her death had galvanized him. Made him into the man, the monster he was to this very day. It was in her memory that he swore to never lead a life of regret, to always act on his impulses. To trust his instincts, to trust the Force which he'd ignored so often in the past. And wear head toes. Looking at him now, this boy cowering before him, Carr saw himself. He saw the foolish, ignorant youth he had been. And he wondered, why was I ever that naive? The thought stirred something inside him. Before anyone could think to stop him, the Sith made a pinching motion with his right hand, bringing his thumb and forefinger dangerously close together. The student rasped in surprise, alarmed to find his airway constricted by the very one whom he'd sworn to serve. The flicker of fear inside him erupted into full-fledged panic. Naruto scowled at him, disgusted. He knew what it was like to be choked by the dark side. The first time he'd been on the receiving of its wrath, he'd nearly panicked himself. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd unleashed his anger and torn his opponent limb from limb. If this boy was to be a true Sith, then he would try to do the same. If not, answer me. Carr growled, holding the boy's life in the palm of his hand. Do you fear me? Do you hate me? The lad stuttered for a long moment, then seemed to realize the doom that was about to befall him. He couldn't lie, because Carr would sense this. He could not remain silent. If he did, the Dark Lord was liable to strike him down, to choke him to death in recompense for his silent temerity. All that was left for him was to tell the truth. Yes. The Darth's face contorted in a rictus of fury. Wrong answer. There was only the softest thrum as Carr's lightsaber pierced the boy's neck and severed his head from his shoulders, rolling onto the ground in a perverse fashion of a ball. His bereft body struck the ground with harsh muffled thud and lay still. There was a gasp from somewhere within the crowd. Every being here was utterly loyal to him, and though it pained him truly to do this, he'd no choice. The boy would never have made it as Sith. He was not strong in mind or body. He was weak. And as master, it was Carr's duty to call the weak Ram the strong. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. He chanted the words as though they were a mantra, passing down the knowledge he'd gleaned from Darthbane, then a mere student to these pupils his own. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Follow these tenets, follow me, and your path shall be revealed. Darth though he might be, it was with a slight pang of regret that he uttered these words, a single command that would end the lives of so many. Attack me. The command was sharp and abrupt, lacking any preamble. All of you. Together. For some of you, this will be your final test. Master. There was a moment of hesitation as his words sank in, a murmur of confusion whilst everyone struggled to realize what he intended. In that moment Carr struck. A swathe of Force lighting erupted from his fingers and ripped into the unprepared recruits, charring dozens to ash. In the time it took them to process this, he stranged 3 more, snapping their necks with a swift and brutal fashion. Attack me. He waited, gauging their reactions, waiting. There. Oddly enough, Brood was the first to comply. The Zabrak was clearly flabbergasted. Although she alongside the others managed to avoid the deadly storm, she was forced down to one knee. She flung a burst of dark side lightning, a dozen bolts of lightning springing from her hands, arcing at the master across from her. Instead of leaping back to avoid the deadly attack, Naruto stepped forward to greet it. He felt her deadly intent and opened himself to it, drinking in her dark desire to end him and feeding off it, growing stronger. Both hands were held in front of him, his arms fully extended at shoulder height, his thumbs touching and his fingers splayed wide. He drew the bolts of lightning into his waiting grasp, channeling them away from their intended target and absorbing their power. Impressive. He chided her, gazing at the energy crackling beneath his hands. Most impressive. You actually meant to kill me with that. However, you'll need more. Maris's eyes went wide as Kar unleashed the power of her own attack against her. She tried to throw up a force shield, but the bolts ripped it apart and continued unabated. The lightning engulfed her, the intense heat depriving her of her defenses, stripping her of her strength and forcing her to the floor. Not killing her, but momentarily removing her from the fight nonetheless. Kar, Grievous lightsabers in each hand, surged forward, intent to take his head. Instead of retreating, the Sith Lord stood his ground and moved his wrist a mere millimeter to the right, allowing the otherwise deadly sword to glance harmlessly of his own blazing blade. Stop using the standard attacks. Kar chastised, warding the Kailash warrior off as effortlessly as one would an upset child. Use the unorthodox. An errant thought pelted the proud warrior with debris, momentarily forcing him back a precious pace. A telltale buzzing at his neck was the only warning the Dark Lord received. Then Mela swooped down on him from on high, her lightsaber carving a crimson arc over their heads. There was a glimmer of hesitation in her movements, her blue-crimson sabers a degree too high. Naruto's fingers closed around empty air and pinched not enough to strangle, but enough to restrain and lifted her into the air. You're not trying. He reprimanded her as the chaos blurred around them. But minus. Naruto hissed. Try. Mela stared at him for a moment, her soft blue eyes narrowing into chips of sapphiric diamond. Kar actually winced as her heel smashed into his neck, breaking his hold on her. And then she moved. There could be no other word for it. One moment she dangled before him, the next she dropped, a blur of azure of crimson and wrathful fury. How often must I tell you? Control my central line. Good. A flick of his fingers sent the Twi'lek skidding across the floor. Scarce had he done so before Ventress was upon him. Faster, he chided, retreating beneath a withering hail of strikes. Destroy my focus. Ventress scowled, her crimson sabers seeming to blur beyond his vision, striking with bone-jarring speed and force. A lesser man might have buckled beneath such an assault, faltered for such a brutal barrage. Kar was no lesser man. An overhead sweep searing through her defense and scored her shoulder, the blade slicing a stinging welt upon her pallid flesh. Her hiss of pain was accompanied by a grunt of exertion. Kar stood his ground when she tried to push him away and retaliated with one of his own, ripping the Nightsister from her feet, flinging her into the hapless bodies her fellow apprentices. You're holding the saber too tightly, he admonished Maris, turning the tide to the offense. He slapped her shoto aside with the palm of his hand, uncaring as blisters immediately bristled beneath his skin. And you too lightly. Kar didn't even bother to turn. He crisscrossed both sabers behind his back, blocking Grievous's overhand swing. A gentle tug of the force ripped the sabers from his hands, disarming him. And Naruto spread that out like a hurricane, and then further still, scouring the earth with unholy fury, striking down all within range. All those Wow could not withstand. Simply ceased to exist. He lowered his arms and exhaled, spent and drained from the effort. Naruto sighed and deactivated his blade, the crimson shaft sinking into the hilt with a sizzling hiss. Of the hundreds of students, only 50 or so remained. His force-conjured storm had utterly eradicated all those who'd been lacking in strength and talent, in the will to survive. But these 50 were the best. The creme of the crop. He was pleasantly surprised to see that his favored disciples had survived as well. Grievous nursed his right arm. Maris had suffered only a light series of burns along the length of her legs. Ventress picked herself up from a pile of debris, looking no worse for the wear. She saw him and smiled, one which he gladly returned. They would serve the cause well. That's it for this part. If you enjoyed it, then like, share and subscribe for the next video, as it's going to be more interesting, and also check out my other playlists. Hope you would like them too.